The following podcast is not meant for children or for liberals, even though that's pretty much the same thing these days, but that's what we're here for. Somebody's got to keep these brats in line. Anyway, you've been warned. It's the right opinion.
These days, our media's either incompetent or malevolent. They don't believe in heaven, but they acting like they heaven sent. Knowing the truth is way harder than telling it. We gotta work harder, gotta be more intelligent. Sometimes we just gotta grab a mic and start yelling shit. We're living in times when it's hard to stay relevant. Be the elephant in the room full of elephants. Be the elephant in the room full of elephants. Boom.
Huge, tremendous, unbelievable. That's the kind of show that we're going to have for you this week right here on the rightopinion.podbean.com. Also available on hackerhameen.podbean.com and ratsaladreview.com. Also be sure to check out The Right Opinion on iTunes, Google Play, and Stitcher, as well as obviously Podbean. I've got so much to talk about this week, guys. So much to talk about. We're going to get into Biden. We're going to get into the whistleblower. We're going to get into why all of this stuff surrounding Ukraine came into the forefront of the American political consciousness as we obviously are coming to the end of this impeachment sham. We're coming up on the State of the Union address. I personally, before I dive into all of that stuff, wanted to just touch on the fact that I was at the Trump rally in Wildwood, New Jersey on Tuesday, I guess January 28th, I believe, and I wish I had a lot of really good stuff to report about it. Unfortunately, I didn't actually get into the rally. Now, I don't want to get into too many details. Basically, it was a long, cold day standing on the beach, basically. Well, not on the beach, but right next to the beach in Wildwood, New Jersey, trying to get into this rally. Got down there with my lady as we were going down for the rally, obviously, but we tried to get down there as early as possible. Her father and sister were down there even earlier than us, and none of us got in. And the line was just ridiculous. Thousands upon thousands of people down there. By the time I got there at 8:30 in the morning, a lot of really poor organization on the part of the people who were operating the line and trying to maintain the cleanup. There was a lot of stories about a lot of the trash that was left. I could say from personal experience, having been there, seen it all in action, yeah, there was a lot of trash left over. There was also a lack of garbage cans, a lack of a cleaning crew, really, which I happened to see walking around, but they quite clearly had no interest in getting into the line to try to remove some of these garbage bags from the garbage cans that were there. And so it kind of left people, but no choice, obviously, unless you want to get out of the line and lose your spot or potentially lose your spot. You didn't really have a whole lot of a choice. Also, worth note is that virtually everything was confiscated from people as they were heading in. There was a giant board of things that you couldn't bring in. People had been camping out for days. They brought chairs, they brought backpacks, they brought coolers, they brought, everything you would need to try to maintain yourself while sitting in a single spot for a couple of days potentially. And all that stuff had to be left outside, and obviously without a bunch of dumpsters or massive garbage cans for them to be put into, they were just left in piles because, again, what choice did people really have? So the Wildwood Convention Center crew down there was woefully underprepared for the amount of people that were there. Having said that, look, guys, I'm a Trump guy. I love Brad Pascal. He's the guy who's running the campaign, or at least the digital end of the campaign for 2020. But he put some numbers out there as far as the attendance of this thing that I just simply don't believe. The RSVP number, as far as the number of tickets that were requested, he said was over 150,000. That I do believe, because it had been 100,000 at a certain point, and then that kept going up from there naturally. The weather was supposed to be really nice that day, or at least as nice as it could be in January on the coast in New Jersey, and it didn't turn out to be that way. So I'm sure a lot of people didn't show up because of that. Having said that, they reported something along 73,000 voters identified. Now, I don't know what exactly that means. It sounds like a very sketchy statistic. There were not 73,000 people standing in that line. I could tell you that firsthand. But, I mean, maybe they interviewed every member of the crew, at the Wildwood Convention Center, anybody who was walking by in the general vicinity of it. I mean, there's possible ways that they could have gotten to that number, but I'm here to tell you that if you think 73,000 people were online trying to get into this event, that's just not the case. Also, the event itself, the venue, rather, the Wildwood Convention Center, only held about maybe 8,000 people. And by the time everybody got in, we left right around the time that the Donald was about to take the stage because we realized we weren't getting in and it was cold and we'd been standing outside literally all day. So it was time to just pack it in and head home. And at that point, like I said, maybe 8,000 people in the building. There were not more than maybe 20,000 people standing outside, if that. I'm probably being generous. So if you wanted to say 30,000 people were trying to get in there in attendance, I would say that's probably a good, if not maybe slightly generous number. Now, granted, there was a lot of people who started leaving earlier because they realized they weren't getting in. Again, it was really cold. There was a lot of people, I'm sure, who showed up, just saw the line, turned right around because they realized immediately they weren't going to get in. So ultimately, let's say even generously 40,000 people. And frankly, 30 to 40,000 people at, on a random Tuesday in 40-something degree weather in a supposedly blue state, and it is a blue state, although I have hopes that maybe, just maybe, it could at least become a slightly more purple state as time goes on. As I live here. I hear a lot of people talking about this sort of stuff. Yes, we have our fair share of liberals here, but we also have our fair share of blue-collar workers, of farmers, of small business owners, and those types of people are benefiting tremendously from the Trump administration, and it's hard for them to sit back. And plus, we're New Jerseyans, right? We're a little loud, we're a little brash, we're a little bit know-it-all-y. And when you hear enough idiots talking about how terrible this president is, when virtually every statistic suggests otherwise, to a certain point, eventually you start to snap out of it and you start to go the other way. And because we're New Jerseyans and we're passionate and we're loud and we're obnoxious, we tend to go and swing the other way pretty hard, pretty swiftly. And I'm seeing a lot of that. As a matter of fact, I have a couple people in my complex that I live in that have discovered recently that I'm a Trump supporter. They are very vocal about it themselves. When they see me, they start talking about it right away. They tell me about how many of their friends have been converted over the last few years. My girlfriend and her sister both were Bernie bros a couple of years ago. They, amongst and many of their friends, have now kind of jumped over to the dark side, I guess, if you will. And I have a lot of hope that New Jersey could at least stop being quite so deep blue. And hopefully we can get some turnout around here and at least start pushing back the other way. And this is why, despite the fact that you might live in a state like I do, where your vote might not matter statistically or as far as the Electoral College goes, it's important for you to get out and vote, because maybe if enough people like yourself get out and vote, we can start shifting the statistics back to where other people might have hope that their votes might count again. And, blue states don't become red states because Republicans don't show up to vote. That is the opposite of how that happens. So get out and vote. Regardless of your political affiliation, it's your civic duty to do so. And as I always like to remind people, if you don't go out and vote, you don't get to complain. Now, granted, obviously the First Amendment gives them that right anyway. But as far as just being, getting less legal with it, more social with it, you sound like an idiot. You really do. Oh, this president sucks. Did you vote? No. Okay, well, you didn't really. You had a say and you didn't use it. So at the end of the day, as far as I'm concerned, your opinion's largely irrelevant. Anyway, so before we get into all of this stuff, and yes, I know I have friends who listen to this show and I know don't vote, and I love you guys, but I'm sorry, I can't listen to your bullshit. I can't. Anyway, so I'm making a lot of friends this week. Anyway, so before we dive into some of the facts and some of the speculation that will, obviously, I hopefully will partition it nicely so that you don't have to go out of your way to decipher what I'm saying is fact and what I'm saying is speculation. I wanted to open up with a series of questions about this Ukraine thing, about this impeachment thing, and I'm going to open with the most simple one of all. Why Ukraine? Right? Why Ukraine? Of all the places, of all the things, of all the the gin joints in the world, kid, why'd you have to come walking into mine? Why Ukraine? What is going on here? Why are they so obsessed with Ukraine, but not at all interested in the Ukrainian election collusion in 2016 that has been admitted by Ukrainian officials, reported on by left-wing Politico, and admitted to some extent, by Alexandra Chalupa, a DNC operative? Why are they so obsessed with Ukraine, but not at all remotely concerned with the corruption surrounding Hunter Biden, Joe Biden, and the Burisma Holdings company that we will be talking a lot about in this show? Why is Joe Biden so sensitive about all this stuff if he didn't do anything wrong? Why were left-wing outlets writing articles about this conflict of interest at the time, but they seem to be completely ignoring it today, despite the fact that they haven't retracted any of these articles and they continue to push forward as if it just didn't exist while it's on their very website that they had concerns about these things when they were going on during the Obama administration? Take a bit of a sidebar here. Why George Soros? Why George Soros? Right? Why does this guy get thrown into everything? Why does he fit into this particular narrative? We're going to get into that as well as we move on throughout the show. The whistleblower. If the whistleblower is fake, as you say, Harrison, if he is a fake, then why is he doing this? Why specifically him? And what does he have to gain and or lose from any of this? And perhaps the most important question of all, but it is the one that you unfortunately are going to have to answer for yourself. If there was a piece of evidence, if there was a piece of evidence, a body of evidence, a mosaic of evidence, as James Comey might say, that would 100% objectively, no doubt about it, exonerate Donald Trump of everything that they've said about him, do you honestly think for a second that the Democrats would stop their incessant attempts to remove him from office? And if the answer to that is no, you're sane, you're a rational being, and it should at the very least make you question everything you've been told about him, about everything you've been told about the holier-than-thou Democrats, about the Ukrainians, etc., etc. And it should especially make you question the media that has been pushing all of this nonsense that has been verified to be false, or at the very least, ignoring things that have been verified to be true. But if you're listening to this show, you're probably already questioning all of that, and I applaud you for doing so. But I implore you to ask this question to your liberal friends, or the liberals in your life. If Donald Trump were 100% honest to God innocent, do you think that the Democrats would stop this 3+ year hissy fit? And better still, would the liberal in your life stop theirs? Questions to ask and questions to answer, some of which I will answer as we get going here. And as a matter of fact, let's do that. Let's dive right into it. Joe Biden's campaign wrote an open letter to reporters recently about this whole Ukrainian scandal. And there was a couple of big takeaways from this letter. It is to reporters and editors from Kate Bedingfield, the deputy campaign manager and communications director, as well as Tony Blinken, a senior advisor to Biden for president. The subject line on this letter reads, and I quote, "The imperative for honest coverage of Trump's Ukraine conspiracy theory," end quote. This was written on January 20th, 2020. Couple of big takeaways from this letter. The first line of the letter reads as follows, and I quote, "Donald Trump is the only American president to have weaponized foreign and national security policy in an attempt to coerce a foreign country into lying about a rival presidential candidate." End quote. A particularly bold statement to start this off, since, he wasn't a member of the Obama administration that unequivocally used foreign and national security policy to investigate Donald Trump based on lies fed to them by foreigners and foreign countries. So, not a hot start there from Joe Biden, but alas, it gets much, much worse, I assure you. The letter goes on a little bit later to say, and I quote, "It is not sufficient to say the allegations are, quote, unsubstantiated, or that, quote, no evidence has emerged to stop them. Not only is there, quote, no evidence for Republicans' main argument against the vice president, there is a mountain of evidence that actively debunks it and is malpractice to ignore that truth," end quote. This is, of course, laughable. I don't even know. It's not even laughable. It's sad. I mean, maybe Joe actually thinks this is true for the 5 minutes that he actually knows where he is. This is hilarious. I mean, we'll have more than enough evidence to back up all of this by the end of this episode, But the idea, well, you know what? Let me get into the last part here because this is really the point. The last thing that Joe's letter says that I want to point out, and I quote, "No political entity, not the Republican Party, nor the Democratic Party, nor the Biden campaign, nor the Trump campaign can ever be allowed to act as your editors," end quote. In an attempt to somehow perfect the art of lacking self-awareness, they are demanding that the press print the news that they deem to be valid while telling the press not to let anyone else be their editors. This is Stalingrad-level propaganda, folks. It's simply astounding to me that the press wouldn't rebel as a result of this. But hey, they are, after all, a bunch of spineless cowards who are completely disinterested in the truth. So, speaking of disinterested in the truth, let's roll right into the Democratic case for impeachment. And I kind of want to piggyback on some of the statements made by Biden and refer you to something that the House manager said in their arguments for further evidence and witnesses of their supposedly ironclad, open and shut case that the president is guilty and needs to be removed from office. The House managers contested often and with regularity during the impeachment trial that, quote, "the Ukrainians say that Hunter Biden did nothing wrong," end quote, which is sort of weird since the Ukrainians said that there was no pressure on the phone call or a quid pro quo or blackmail or extortion of any kind, but apparently that wasn't viable. However, when they say that Hunter Biden did nothing wrong, even though it's been long since established that case simply did not reach its conclusion because of the interference of Hunter Biden's father, essentially Joe Biden. Sleepy, creepy, flippy, floppy, sloppy Joe over here, quid pro Joe, if you will. And you know what, in order to kind of get a better picture of exactly what's been going on or what had gone on in Ukraine, I went into a deep dive. A couple weekends ago, I sat around all day, 2 days actually, and just read Kiev Post articles about what was going on, searching Burisma, searching Zlochevsky, who is the founder, CEO of Burisma, searching Biden, searching Shokin, searching Lutsenko, searching Yarema, searching all these prosecutors that we've heard so much about, or unfortunately have not heard enough about. And I've surmised the following, and I got a list of points here that I think is going to kind of give you an overview of what's going on in Ukraine. But I'm going to take the Bongino rule here, and I'm going to tell you what I'm going to tell you, and then I'm going to tell you, and then I'm going to tell you what I told you. So basically, the quick synopsis of these points here is that Ukraine is a very corrupt country. And as a result, there's corruption, and then there's usually a call for reform. And then as a result of that reform, somebody is then replaced, or an oversight committee is put in place to look over whoever they assume is corrupt. And then ultimately what ends up happening is that oversight committee or the replacement for the person that was corrupt ends up being as corrupt, if not more corrupt, than the original corruption that they were supposed to monitor. That's the skinny. That's like the brief, dumbed-down synopsis. That said, let's get into a little bit more detail here. So Ukraine, a very corrupt country. I think I mentioned on my last podcast that Ernst & Young had declared them one of the top 3 most corrupt countries in the world. Also worth note, I happen to work at a place that employs a lot of Ukrainians, and a lot of them still have family back home. And I kind of ran this list by a few of them, and they seem to be more or less in agreement with my synopsis that I mentioned before, which is that there's corruption. They try to figure out the corruption, and the people that are put in place to solve the corruption end up being just as corrupt as the original corruption. So number 2 on my list here, I'm not going to give you the numbers for all these. I'll just try and go along like bullet points. But for whatever reason, Google Docs formatted this in a list form with numbers. But the current administration, namely President Zelensky, was voted into office to reform the corruption, as previous presidents had been as well. The previous president before Zelensky was Poroshenko, who was also voted in to be a reformer because the previous president, Yanukovych, had basically robbed the country of billions of dollars. He was a Russian sympathizer. He did a bunch of sketchy stuff, and he ended up just up and leaving the country altogether at the end of his presidency with a boatload of money that they are still trying to ascertain to this day. Moving on, Poroshenko's first prosecutor general, the equivalent of our AG, so they have the PG, we have the AG, was Vitaly Yarema. Now, Yarema stated in January 16 of 2015 that investigations into Zlochevsky, who is the Burisma founder, was a top priority. So he was recognizing it, although what was he actually doing about it, we'll find out in the next point, which is on January 23rd, a whole week later in 2015, the UK, the United Kingdom, actually freezes a bunch of, had frozen a bunch of Zlochevsky's seized assets due to negligence by Urema. Those assets ended up getting unfrozen because basically the UK reached out to Ukraine and their prosecutor general, who was Urema, and said, we need all these documents so that we can close this case on Zlochevsky. And Urema just basically didn't do anything. And in some reports had actually gone as far as to call the United Kingdom or communicate with them and express to them that they, the Ukraine, don't actually have any incriminating evidence against Zlochevsky, and so Zlochevsky's assets were unfrozen and he was allowed to continue on doing his corrupt business practices. So in 1 week, he's claiming that the investigation is important, recognizing that Zlochevsky is a bad guy, Burisma is up to no good, but then neglects to actually provide the United Kingdom with the evidence that they need to hold his funds. So it's a lot of lip service, but not a lot of actual work being done. A lot of sizzle, no steak. That was Urema. So Urema gets ousted, and he's replaced by former Prosecutor General Viktor Shokin, who's somebody you've probably heard a few words or two about on this show, and most certainly, if you've been paying attention to the impeachment scandal, have heard a few comments about him. In February of 2015, Shokin takes over. And again, he's another guy who's put in place to try to quell some of the corruption that's going on. Now, despite what the media will tell you, Shokin was absolutely looking into Biden and Burisma, and absolutely was still looking into Biden and Burisma when he was fired. In fact, he was scheduled to interview Hunter Biden the very next day after he was fired, which may very well explain why Joe Biden was in such a rush to get this guy fired. And this is according to a conversation that he had with reporter John Solomon. This is not just, this is Shokin saying that he was fully prepared to go and question Hunter Biden as a result of the next steps in his Burisma investigation. Now, Pam Bondi, one of the representatives for Donald Trump, I guess the defense in the impeachment, had presented a Kiev Post article during the impeachment on January 27th, 2020, that's when she was speaking, not the article, stating that the investigation into Burisma was inexplicably still active and Hunter Biden was a person of interest. So it's not only Shokin saying it, this is the Kiev Post, a Ukrainian paper, the oldest Ukrainian paper. I guess if the New York Times was anywhere near as legitimate as people like to think it is here, the Kiev Post would essentially be the equivalent of their New York Times over there in Ukraine. Moving on, he claimed, Shokin that is, that there was pressure to stop the investigation. Now this is where it starts to get muddy, and this is part of the reason I think that they chose Ukraine for this. This is the why Ukraine, is that Ukraine, the muddiest of waters, right? It's very weird. There's a lot of corruption, but they're also an ally. They have a lot of elements within the country that are pro-Russia, whereas a majority of the country is against Russia and trying to actively work against those Russian, sympathizing interests. So it's a lot of weird kind of muddied waters, not to mention it's Ukraine, right? It's not China, it's not Germany, it's not France. Most people don't know a lot about what's going on in Ukraine. And based on my research and my conversations with my Ukrainian coworkers, it's pretty hard to fully understand what's going on in Ukraine unless you're there and living amongst it. Again, I read dozens upon dozens of Kiev Post articles, and even in there, it's really hard to ascertain exactly what's going on. Maybe they actually do this thing called journalism where they present both sides, and I'm just not used to it, but there's a lot of push and pull going on over there as far as who's really corrupt, who's really stopping the corruption, and Shokin, from what I can tell, appeared to potentially be trying to actually do something about this, but he was receiving pushback. Now, the only person who could really give Shokin pushback would be somebody much higher in the hierarchy, I guess, or the government structure than he. He's the prosecutor general. He's the AG. He answers to, essentially, the president. Well, the president at the time was Poroshenko, and there had been calls for Poroshenko to fire Shokin, which were coming from ANTAC, which is an anti-corruption NGO, essentially, that happens to be funded not only by George Soros, but also by U.S. taxpayer dollars. Go figure. And NABU, which is the National Anti-Corruption Bureau, is another Ukrainian anti-corruption. This was an actual law enforcement agency, which was later found out to be surveilling the prosecutor general's office. Once Shokin left, the guy who took over for him found out that they were essentially spying on them. So it comes down to me, and this is another one of those kind of bigger picture items, is that the folks in Ukraine that are actually trying to do something about corruption are often running in to allegations of corruption for looking into the corruption. So I think you're corrupt. I look into you. In order to try to get me off your case, you say I'm corrupt for looking into you, and this cycle continues where nothing ever gets done. It sounds very much like our Congress. Then Poroshenko, despite the calls to fire Shokin, refuses to fire Shokin. But why? If Poroshenko liked Shokin so much, then why is he trying to stop him from investigating Burisma, Zlochevsky, and for that matter, Biden? Well, and here, this is breaking. This is first time you'll only hear this analysis here. I think Biden, as a matter of fact, I know. Biden was dangling military aid over their heads the entire time he was dealing with them since the annexation of Crimea, and they also have some issues going on involving the Russians in the Donbass region, Donbas. So Russian aggression is a thing. They need more than MREs and blankets, which is what Obama had been sending them. Never at any point sent them a single missile or a single piece of offensive military aid. But Biden was leaving the door open in all of his discussions with them, with Poroshenko in particular. Now, Poroshenko could be as corrupt as any of the other leaders there, and Shokin, for that matter, I'm willing to concede, might have been as corrupt as everybody else there. But why is Poroshenko telling Shokin, yeah, you're my guy and I'm going to keep you there, but I don't want you to follow up this investigation on Burisma. You're going to have to stop this stuff. And I surmise that it's because Biden was dangling the possibility that they would get military aid, and if in fact Shokin was going to continue to look into Burisma, Zlochevsky, Hunter Biden, and by extension Joe Biden, they were never going to get that aid. Now, I don't have a direct quote from Biden on any of this stuff, but I do have plenty of articles from a variety of outlets, as a matter of fact, because Kiev Post not only posts their own articles, but they also source other ones. June 13th, 2015, Kiev Post headline, Poroshenko counts on Biden's support in strengthening defense capability of Ukraine army. May 28, 2015, as reported by CNN, cross-posted by the Kiev Post, Biden blasts Putin, saying U.S. debating sending weapons to Ukraine, which we most certainly were, but by mentioning that, especially in a speech in the Ukraine, it's sort of sending the message that he's leaving the door open for them to potentially get that if, of course, they're good little boys and do exactly what old Uncle Creepy Joe tells them to do. February 8th, 2015, from Voice of America, Biden promised United States will help Ukraine defend itself if necessary. Well, not for nothing, a whole chunk of their land was annexed by a world power. Seems pretty fucking necessary to me, Joe, but neither here nor there. February 7th, 2015, from Reuters, Biden says Ukraine has the right to defend itself against Russia. Of course, you're going to be no help in that matter, are you, Joe? Even though you're going to continue to kind of leave it open. Maybe we'll give you a hand one of these days. Just continue to do exactly what we tell you to do. February 6, 2015, the Agence France Presse, the French press agency, I suppose. Biden says that Ukraine is fighting for their very survival. Yeah, that seems like a fight you might want to give a little bit of a hand to, huh, Joe? Maybe you want to give them a little bit of military aid. Maybe you want to at least recognize their need for it so that you can dangle it over their heads in hopes that certain prosecutors won't look into certain companies who employ certain sons of certain vice presidents. Just throwing it out there, folks. I mean, it's not really a very difficult series of dots to connect, right? Biden's over there. He doesn't like Poroshenko. He doesn't like the fact that Poroshenko has Shokin as a prosecutor. He had actually expressed, by the way, several months before ultimately putting down that quid pro quo, that he wanted Shokin fired, and they didn't fire him. In December of 2015, they told him, we're not going to fire him, even though you keep calling for it. And he came back a few months later with that $1 billion loan guarantee from the IMF and said, well, you remember that prosecutor we talked about? Well, if you don't get rid of him, you're not getting this $1 billion, otherwise known to rational sentient beings as a quid pro quo. So it seems that Joe was dangling this military aid over the Ukrainians' head, saying, like, do exactly what we tell you to do, and maybe, just maybe, we'll give you some missiles so that you can fight for your lives. And he may very well have been dangling other aid as well, because it appears every time Joe went to Ukraine, 6 times in total during his time in the Obama administration, the last of which was 3 days before he left office, begging the question, why? Whatever he was trying to do there was about to be undone in 3 days, so it's sort of weird that he would go to Ukraine with 3 days left in his vice presidency unless, he had a cleanup job to do. It's the only logical explanation I can come up with. Anyway, so Joe goes to Ukraine 6 times during the Obama administration, like I just mentioned, and every time he goes, he's asking for reforms, particularly in regards to corruption, which, granted, are probably necessary, but Joe Biden most certainly not the type of person you want to have overseeing corruption, as I'll have a bonus episode coming out about the Biden crime family in the not-too-distant future, so make sure you're subscribed to the rightopinion.podbean.com to get that. It will be an exclusive, although that particular one I might post across all of the available platforms here, because I think that's going to be really important, and hopefully I could do it kind of quickly and succinctly so that I'm not dragging on for too long there. But the most famous instance of Biden obviously hanging money over the Ukrainians' heads was that whole thing about firing Shokin, but it appears every time he shows up to Ukraine, he's got some sum of money to give them and asks for some reforms to be put into place. Now, moving on from there, speaking of some of those reforms, was the Prosecutor General's office receiving pressure from other entities to stop doing whatever it was they were doing regarding Burisma? As I mentioned before, we have ANTAC and NABU. ANTAC, an NGO funded by Soros and our taxpayer dollars, and NABU, a anti-corruption law enforcement agency put in place to oversee the prosecutor's office, essentially like an IAB, an Internal Affairs Bureau. NABU happened to be put into place in October of 2014, shortly after a visit from Biden and, for that matter, pressure from the IMF and the EU saying, you guys got to do something about this, put this organization into place, or we're not going to be able to give you any future loan guarantees. That was another one where money was being dangled over their head, not just by the US, but by the EU and IMF. Artem Sitnik is a name that I should be mentioning a few times throughout the course of this process. He is the director of NABU, and he said in 2016, January of 2016, to be precise, as printed by the Kiev Post, there was no correlation between the loan guarantees and the firing of Shokin. Seems pretty weird, being that we legitimately have Biden on tape saying the total opposite. So this is the type of guy that's in place. This is the the director of the Anti-Corruption Bureau in Ukraine, saying that there was no linkage whatsoever between the loan guarantees and the firing of Shokin, a statement that we know 100% is verifiably false. This is the guy overlooking the anti-corruption in the Ukraine. Pardon me, Ukraine. Anyway, Sitnik has since been caught on tape, to make things even worse, bragging about, can't make this stuff up, folks, helping the DNC by providing information about Paul Manafort, which is supposedly the ledger which was passed to Alexandra Chalupa. More on that in a bit. But this is the guy overlooking the anti-corruption of the supposed corruption of the Prosecutor General's office. He's the guy who's directing the organization that's overseeing it. He didn't see any correlation between the loan and the firing of Shokin, which is obviously laughable at this point, and he was actively helping the DNC gather information on Paul Manafort to get him ousted and to tie the Russia nonsense to the Trump campaign. By the way, I said we'll have more on that in a little bit, but the ledger that was produced not only has not been verified to this day, but people in Ukraine had been warning U.S. intelligence officers not to trust it because it hasn't been verified, and frankly, anything going on in the circles from which that they got it from probably shouldn't be trusted. Moving on, after Shokin was fired, his deputy was promoted as an interim prosecutor general for a period of time, but then a gentleman by the name of Yuri Lutsenko takes over just 2 months later. This is the Biden-approved guy, right? This is the guy that was put in place to replace the guy that Biden didn't like. And now here he is taking over the position. We're going to hear more from Mr. Lutsenko as time goes on, so remember that name. Another name to remember, and granted, I understand it's hard. I work with a lot of Ukrainians. Again, all these names get a little convoluted in your head after a period of time. But remember the name Andrei Teleshenko, who had worked as an advisor to Shokin under Poroshenko and was approached by Alexandra Chalupa of DNC operative and of Atlantic Council fame, or infamy, I suppose, to find dirt, Russian dirt at that, on Donald Trump. This is considered a conspiracy theory by the media when it's all verifiable 100%. Chalupa denies that she was ever doing anything untoward. Here is a little clip from a November 2019 article that quotes her, and I quote, "It's clear Republicans are gaslighting the public by putting me on their list of witnesses," she said. "It's a bluff meant to smear and distract from Donald Trump's impeachable offenses. I'm the last person Republicans want to testify publicly. My testimony would be especially damaging to Donald Trump, Paul Manafort, and Vladimir Putin. The GOP knows this." End quote. Okay, so she's still of the delusion because this was her life's work that came crashing down and it hurt inside. Yes, that's a Hulk Hogan reference. The GOP, for some reason, would care about her having damaging testimony against Vladimir Putin. Why would anyone care about this? Also, Paul Manafort's like in jail. He's not the campaign manager for Trump anymore. Who cares? Furthermore, does anyone honestly believe that if this woman had more information on Donald Trump, that she wouldn't have already shared it with the Justice Department or the special counsel's office or the media? Does anyone actually believe that for a second? No, that's what I thought. Anyway, moving on from there. The Black Ledger that she found on Manafort was supposedly a record of a bunch of illegal payments that he was getting. It's like his little black book. They call it the Black Ledger to make it sound all nefarious and stuff and whatever. But she found this information on Manafort, and it was likely a fake, according to Ukrainian authorities who warned the U.S. Justice Department of the shady nature of the document from John Solomon, who was writing for The Hill at the time, and I quote, "For example, Ukrainian's top anti-corruption prosecutor Nazar Kolodnitsky," that's what we're going with, "he told me he warned the U.S. State Department's law enforcement liaison and multiple FBI agents in late summer 2016 that Ukrainian officials who recovered the ledger believed it was likely a fraud," from The Hill. Also later in the article, it was not to be considered a document of Manafort. It was not authenticated, and at the time, it should not be used in any way to bring accusations against anybody, said Kolodnitsky, who says he told FBI agents the same thing. So, this guy, an anti-corruption officer, and granted, I don't know what to make of any of that, but apparently the U.S. government has seemed to figure out which people to listen to in Ukraine and which people not to listen to in Ukraine, and coincidentally, the people that they do want to listen to in Ukraine are all the people that benefit the Democrats and the cover-up of their corruption. Meanwhile, all the people that they want to ignore in Ukraine seem to be have beneficial information to Donald Trump, the Republican agenda, and against any of the mainstream media nonsense that's being spewed about and is being actively debunked by these people leaking out information. Now, I think it's a little odd that all goes one way. The argument could be made that I'm claiming it goes the other way, but if you're telling me that you trust the government all that much, whew, do I got some shit to sell you. Anyway, number 19 on my list, let's go back to Yuri Lutsenko, who is the Biden-approved prosecutor general, was put in place after Shokin was fired. He was quoted as saying that NABU, the National Anti-Corruption Bureau of Ukraine, was, quote, uncontrollable, which would be a weird admission if he was actively trying to, quote, control them in a nefarious sense. He discovered that NABU was actually spying on the prosecutor's office when he took over. They had been spying on the previous prosecutor general, Viktor Shokin, because Viktor Shokin had the temerity to look into the corruption that was going on in Burisma with Zlochevsky and with Hunter Biden, and they were labeling him as corrupt in an attempt to oust him as corrupt so that they can continue on with, guess what, their corruption. Yes, all right, you guys are following along now. NABU and ANTAC have just cast a variety of corruption allegations at the three prosecutors that I've mentioned up to this point, Urima, Shokin, and Lutsenko, who was the Biden-approved guy, who was, of course, somehow also corrupt, because God forbid he was trying to do his job and look into the actual corruption. They just hurl corruption allegations at all three of these guys, and the only charges seem to be that they're corrupt because they're looking into, quote, the wrong things. Anyway, kind of getting to the end here, the biggest takeaway is that in the last decade, and probably much longer than that, is that there have been repeated attempts to quell corruption in Ukraine, and each time there seems to be someone put in place to oversee the corruption who is just as corrupt, if not more corrupt, than the person or entity that they're supposed to be monitoring for corruption in the first place. In summation, as far as the prosecutor generals go, Yaryma, the Vitaly Yaryma, the original prosecutor that I talked about who was in place under Poroshenko, the guy was a joke. He was clearly not interested in any way, shape, or form of really getting to the bottom of what was going on with Zlochevsky, perhaps at the bequest of Poroshenko, who may very well have been kind of held hostage to a certain degree by Biden. Then we have Viktor Shokin, who appeared to be making some genuine attempts to get some stuff done. Had actually filed some paperwork and had actually set up some interviews with some people related to Burisma. He was fired by Biden, obviously, or essentially, and up to that point was receiving a bunch of pushback from Poroshenko, from Antak, and from NABU, all of these organizations, well, those two organizations supposedly trying to oversee corruption activity again. And then we get Shokin leaves, an interim guy is put into place for a couple months. He doesn't really do anything at all, and then Lutsenko takes over, and he is the Biden-approved guy, and he was still looking into Burisma and even looking into NABU because their director had openly admitted into being involved in election interference in 2016. Got all that? I know it's a lot to take. You're 40 minutes in. Feel free to pause, rewind, run that bitch back, and then I will catch you with a couple of my side points here right now. A couple of side points. People on the left like to talk about how the Burisma investigation started before Hunter Biden was even employed there, to which I will say, correct. And that's precisely the point. Hunter Biden was not hired by Burisma to stop future investigations. Hunter Biden was hired by Burisma to stop the active investigations. Is that Hunter Biden's presence on the board would make it very difficult for Joe Biden to want to see corruption activities in that company be brought to light. So, Hunter Biden joins the board, Joe Biden's actively handling Ukraine foreign policy for us, and he goes over there and he dangles some aid. He dangles some military aid. He even dangles some influence over the heads of the existing presidents who may very well be corrupt and may very well actually want to look into this. We'll probably never know. What I do know is that Hunter Biden was working at a company that he had no business working at, didn't speak Ukrainian, had no experience in the field, and was making an exorbitant amount of money above and beyond even the other board members who did have those things. He shows up after the investigations have been getting closer and closer to Zlochevsky. Mind you, the whole incident in the United Kingdom had occurred, and prosecutors in the Ukraine are openly talking about looking into Burisma and Zlochevsky and claiming it's a top priority. And so Zlochevsky, in a stroke of brilliance, really, give the guy some credit. If you're going to be corrupt, be good at it. This guy appears to be one of those. He decides that he needs to bring in some influential figures to sit on the board to try to, garner some sympathies and garner some favor from other entities around the world who may very well be also looking into this. And so they bring aboard, not only, I think, the son of the president of Poland or a former president of Poland, but they bring in Hunter Biden, who happens to have a father who just so happens to be overlooking Ukrainian foreign policy for the biggest, baddest motherfucking country in the world. It's worth considering, at the very least. Another side point here, Soros. George Soros is one of these names that gets thrown around in an almost comical fashion at this point, but here's some of the deets and some of the connections to Soros in this situation. Soros has a lot of financial interest in Ukraine. He also is involved and invested in a lot of energy companies there, not Burisma, but rivals to Burisma. Also, one of his other main economic rivals in the region is a guy named Dmitry Firtash, and they are often competing for land and for contracts and for all this other stuff. Soros is using his influence via political donations to get the U.S. to stop investigating his organization, Antak, and to start investigating Firtash and his organizations because it's economically beneficial and financially beneficial for him to do so. Also, another connection to Soros is that Soros also just so happens to fund the group that had initially looked into Lev Parnas and Igor Fruman, associates of Rudy Giuliani, who were helping him make contacts with people in Ukraine so that he can dig up the dirt on Biden, which is not in any way unethical. It's called opposition research. You don't want dirt dug up on you? Don't have dirt to be dug up on you in the first place. So Parnas and Fruman working for Giuliani at the time, the first company that actually files a complaint and starts looking into these guys is a I think they're called the CLC. It's like the Community Law something or other. It's irrelevant. It's a group that's funded by George Soros, coincidentally, I'm sure. And the big kicker here is Dmitry Firtash is actually mentioned in the article written by Fusion GPS founder Glenn Simpson and his wife Mary Jacoby in 2007 in the Wall Street Journal, where he tried the rough draft, essentially, of the Russia collusion hoax on John McCain as he was building up to his election against Barack Obama. So Dmitry Firtash, Paul Manafort, a lot of these sorts of names have popped up in that 2007 article written by the founder of Fusion GPS, the company that paid Christopher Steele to supposedly write a dossier, even though details are coming in more and more that it's making it less and less likely that Steele was the one actually writing a large swath of the dossier, and that it may very well have been a movie script written by Fusion GPS founder Glenn Simpson, and just a reiteration of this 2007 Wall Street Journal article that he wrote about John McCain at the time. A lot of the names, a lot of the accusations are the exact same if you just take out John McCain and insert Donald Trump. This had been tried before, 10 years earlier or 9 years earlier, and they were trying it all over again, except they needed something to provide legitimacy to all of it, so they found former MI6 spy Christopher Steele and put his name on it, saying, look, this guy's legit. He helped us fight FIFA, and now he's going to help us fight Trump and Russia. It's all a bunch of malarkey. At the end of the day, really what it comes down to is that Soros is trying to get Firtash investigated and trying to get his own entities uninvestigated so that he can continue thriving financially in Ukraine, push out his biggest rival, and, oh, by the way, happen to get the prosecutor fired who was looking into not only Joe Biden's son's company, but his company. Worth no. Soros also co-funding ANTAC, as I mentioned before, heavily involved in trying to thwart the anti-corruption efforts of some of the prosecutors over time. ANTAC is working with, or at the very least running parallel to, NABU, the National Anti-Corruption Bureau of Ukraine, which is the special anti-corruption prosecutor's office put in place at the demand of IMF, the International Monetary Fund, who was providing the loan guarantee to them on behalf of, through Joe Biden, and the European Union. And we're going to actually talk about the European Union and some good old-fashioned globalism at the end of this show, but if George Soros likes anything, it's a good globalist. And Obama and Biden and the EU all fit that bill. Glenn Simpson of Fusion GPS, who would later be working on behalf of Hillary, may very well fit that bill as well, or at the very least is willing to play along with it for the right amount of money. Hillary, who the Ukraine was actively helping, definitely fits the globalist strategy, and Donald Trump stood and stands in defiance of all of that. He had to be, and to this day still has to be, taken down in order for these globalist elites to succeed. Oh, by the way, the group ANTAC, there's that same group that Shokin was told to lay off of. Who told him to lay off of that group? Oh, you're not going to believe this, folks. Two different people, as a matter of fact, one in person and one in letter form, both of which happen to be the star witnesses for the Democrats in the impeachment hearing. Yes, George Kent had written a letter to the Prosecutor General's office saying basically, I know you're looking into this ANTAC group because you think some of U.S. funds went to the wrong place. We are aware of where they went, and we are fully satisfied with that. Meaning that this money may very well have been falling into the wrong hands, and the Prosecutor General's office had noticed it, and George Kent and the U.S. government said, nah, don't worry about it. We know our money is going into funding further corruption, and we are completely fine with that. Stop looking into that ANTAC group. Also, Marie Yovanovitch had not spoken with Shokin, I believe, but had spoken with Litsenko, the Biden-approved guy. She went to go meet him. As a matter of fact, invited him to meet with her, sat him down, and started verbally giving him a list of people that he should not be prosecuting. He went on to write that list down, and she claims, now there's like this whole muck and mire of, I never gave him a list, and he's like, no, you never physically gave me a list, but you started to give me a list, so I started to write them down, and that's when she went into a panic and realized that this guy wasn't going to play ball either, and then she went on her anti-Trump campaign from there, which ultimately led to her firing, and she, as a matter of fact, just left the State Department this week, coincidentally on the same day that Mike Pompeo was in Ukraine. That may very well be a coincidence, but if not, it'd be very interesting to find out what the linkage is. Anyway, so they also, this is another side point, they claim that the Ukraine did not interfere in our elections, and furthermore, they make the claim that Republicans are saying that Ukraine interfered in our elections instead of Russia interfering in our elections, which couldn't be further from the truth. No reasonable, rational person would tell you that Russia didn't interfere in our elections. As a matter of fact, if you went back 5 to 10 years ago, long before any of this stuff, and you asked any reasonable person, do you think Russia's interfering in our elections, we would have all said yes. That's sort of what Russia does. This is obviously easily debunked, this notion that Ukraine didn't interfere in our elections. As I mentioned, the admissions of Alexandra Chalupa, Artem Sitnik, the director of the National Anti-Corruption Bureau in Ukraine, Yuri Lutsenko, the sitting prosecutor, or the prosecutor at the time that was filling in for Shokin, the Biden-approved prosecutor is Lutsenko, and many others. And this is also backed up by the reporting of Kenneth Vogel, who was writing for left-wing Politico in 2017, the article that repeatedly keeps popping up from right-wingers because we are sick of being told that we're making up conspiracy theories while we're sitting here quoting left-wing outlets. If you're going to quote to me every stupid Politico article when it prints something negative about Trump, you're going to have to take the Politico article when it says something negative about Ukraine, about the DNC, and about Joe Biden. Furthermore, House managers have claimed that Trump didn't care about Biden until Biden announced his presidential candidacy. I mean, first and foremost, was there ever any real doubt that Joe Biden was going to run? And why would Trump wait for that announcement? That seems rather odd. This is also debunked somewhat embarrassingly easily, if, of course, the Democrats had any actual shame, by the fact that Giuliani had been digging around Ukraine 6 months prior to Joe Biden announcing his candidacy. So they're claiming that Trump waited until the announcement to start caring about Biden, but Giuliani was already in Ukraine digging around 6 months before Joe Biden ever announced. And for that matter, he has reported on several outlets that Biden's name was brought to him. He wasn't looking for dirt on Biden. He was looking for information regarding 2016 election interference and CrowdStrike and other things related to potentially the Steele dossier. And Ukraine is so riddled with corruption, and it just so happens that if you dig around enough of the corruption, you might find other corruption, and that's when somebody presented the Burisma, Joe Biden, Zlochevsky case to him. So he wasn't there looking for dirt on Biden. He was there looking for Ukrainian corruption information, and just so happened to be given Joe Biden's name. It's all the more complicated by the layers of corruption that go on in Ukraine, which is precisely why this is one of the hills that the Democrats have chosen to die on, because they're so convinced that you will never figure out exactly what was going on in Ukraine. And having done some research myself, it's still hard to ascertain fully exactly what's going on there. But if you do enough digging, you can figure out that there's enough muddy waters to realize that nobody's clean in any of this sort of stuff. And that should ultimately lead you to a point where you don't exactly know who to believe. And whenever I find myself there, I tend to believe the opposite of what the mainstream media is telling me, because that's generally where the truth resides. Anyway, that leads me to a recent report from Laura Ingraham. Mainstream media outlet, yes, but she did some good work. I actually don't watch a lot of Laura Ingraham, but she's been doing some really good stuff on this whistleblower character. His name, by the way, is Eric Ciaramella, Ciaramella, Ciaramella. But folks, I am not the Inspector General of the intelligence community, so I'm allowed to tell you that. Ingraham's team doesn't use his name throughout the course of the reporting there, but Paul Sperry has exposed this as an open secret, and it was discovered this week, even during the impeachment hearings. This is after the Laura Ingraham story had dropped, is that Rand Paul asked the question of Chief Justice Roberts to read to the House managers and to the president's defense team, mentioning the name Eric Ciaramella, and he was accused not only of John Roberts, but by the House managers and Democrats of trying to expose the whistleblower. So if Eric Ciaramella is not the whistleblower, why couldn't we read a question about him that had nothing to do, or nor did it mention the term or the accusation of being a whistleblower? Seems sort of odd. And to me, this is already something that we've talked about in the initial hearings in the House, is that anytime this guy's name was brought up, everyone went into a panic on the Dem side. Adam Schiff started throwing a hissy fit. We're going to protect the whistleblower. We're going to protect the whistleblower. Well, in order to protect the whistleblower, somebody needs to know who the whistleblower is in order to find that name, snatch it out of the air, and say, no, we can't talk about this guy. He's definitely not the whistleblower, though. It seems very odd. It seems rather weird that Chief Justice Roberts knew who the whistleblower was, and for that matter was willing to, basically give up the goods here, right? He showed their hand on this one, is that if you ask a question about this guy and we're not allowed to read it because we need to protect the whistleblower, well, sounds pretty obvious that he's the whistleblower. And maybe in the wake of that, Laura Ingraham's team has started to use the name. I don't know, but this is a story from earlier, probably around mid-January, when they were talking about the whistleblower. His name is Eric Ciaramella, but they won't say as much, as I've mentioned. And Laura Ingraham's team just so happened to uncover that in January of 2016, there was a meeting at the White House. Not something that is easy to come by, folks. Not everybody gets a meeting at the White House. And this meeting was featuring Ukrainian officials, including Andrei Teleshenko, advisor to Prosecutor General Viktor Shokin. I mentioned him before and told you to remember the name. And one of the other people that was there just so happened to be then lead anti-corruption prosecutor Nazar Zolotnitsky. Remember him from before. It's the name I was having a lot of difficulty with. So you got two of these anti-corruption prosecutor types meeting at the White House in a meeting in January of 2016. It's a year before Trump was about to take over. And as we were grinding into the last, the home stretch of the election there, the last year of the election, it was a meeting that took place involving these Ukrainian anti-corruption officials and appeared to be about corruption in the Ukraine related to Burisma Holdings and Hunter Biden. Now, the person who was working on this story was actually working for the New York Times at the time. It is Kenneth Vogel, the guy who wrote the Politico article in 2017 about the Ukrainian election interference. And he was working on this article, on this story related to this meeting in January 2016 with Ukrainian anti-corruption prosecutors and White House officials, including the whistleblower Eric Ciaramella, who was the one who signed these Ukrainian officials into the White House. He knew, folks. He knew the whole time, and he knew his name was going to be attached to it if it ever came up, which may very well be his motivation for blowing the whistle on a conversation that we now know verifiably is not what he claimed it to be in the first place. Now, back to Kenneth Vogel here. Why would he write this article back in 2017 in Politico about the Ukrainian interference, but not write this particular article? And I think the short answer is that back in 2017, when he wrote that article for Politico, he had no idea that Ukraine would be at the center of this big controversy related to the president. And if he had, he would have kept his fucking mouth shut, because he would have never, because now he's in a funky spot where this story is getting pushed out there repeatedly as evidence that our media, at a bare minimum, was at least aware of the fact that Ukrainians were interfering in the 2016 election. He can't retract it because it's true, and he doesn't want to hurt his own credibility. So he's kind of left in this murky land. Now he's writing from the New York Times, and he's got this article about this Ukrainian meeting, and maybe, just maybe, he's burying it because He doesn't want to bring any of this stuff to light anymore, or he doesn't want to add on to the already existing damage he's done to the media narratives. Furthermore, is that maybe he didn't, maybe couldn't get enough information all the way, but this information, these emails that Laura Ingram's team were sent, got to them somehow. Maybe Kenneth Vogel was told by the New York Times that they're not going to run this story, and he passed it over to the Ingraham team so that they can go ahead and get the story out there. Now, I checked Kenneth Vogel's social media in the days after this Ingraham story. Not a peep from this guy about this story being debunked, which leads me to believe that, yeah, he probably did leak this to Fox. He probably did leak this to Laura Ingram's team, and the New York Times wasn't going to run with it, but he wanted the truth to get out there. So hat tip to Kenneth Vogel if any of that is true. And the Kenneth Vogel 2017 Politico article, by the way, is like a prime example of why I like to quote the liberal media outlets, because they often give themselves away by accident. The thing about lying is that when you have enough lies up in the air, it's hard to juggle all of them. And if you don't know that something is going to be a lie 2 years down the road, you don't know not to lie about it now. And Kenneth Vogel may have very well exposed the entire media by running that article in January of 2017 in Politico, stating unequivocally and laying out in every way, shape, or form how Ukraine interfered in the 2016 election. And I was under the impression that we as a country are very, very serious about interference from any other foreign countries in our election. Did they put $100,000 worth of Facebook ads out there? No. But they did do other things. They did make an attempt to help one specific side. There is unequivocal evidence that they were only helping the DNC. And no one seems to care. Why? Well, because it would go towards the case of helping Donald Trump. And funnily enough, Politico still has not pulled that article, but that hasn't stopped them from writing multiple articles that contradict that article, because they don't actually have an ounce of journalistic or intellectual integrity. But they want to get the more information out there so that when you type in Politico Ukraine, you get other stories that are not that story, including how a Russian disinfo op got Trump impeached from January 22nd of 2020. From January 25th of 2020, forget impeachment. Republicans fear Ukraine revelation could spill into election. And the reason I point out that Politico is trying to muddy the waters as far as the Ukrainian stuff, and the reason I point out that Kenneth Vogel may not have necessarily ran with the story because he works for the New York Times, who aren't interested in the truth, and I point out that Laura Ingraham reported this and you didn't hear a damn peep out of Kenneth Vogel refuting a word of it, because the story very much is the emails. The emails discovered by Ingraham's team were sent by Ken Vogel to the State Department, a particular official by the name of Kate Schilling, on May 1st of 2019, and the email reads, and I quote, "We are going to report that State Department official Elizabeth Zentos attended a meeting with the White House on January 19, 2016, with Ukrainian prosecutors and embassy officials, as well as redacted," that's Eric Ciaramella, "from the NSC. The subject discussed includes efforts within the United States government to support prosecutions in Ukraine and the United Kingdom of Burisma Holdings, and concerns that Hunter Biden's position with the company would complicate such efforts." End quote. Well, you don't say. In January of 2016? Now, I thought no one had ever even considered for a moment that Joe Biden and his son could possibly have anything to do with anything even remotely resembling a conflict of interest in Ukraine. It couldn't be. No. He's a Democrat. They are physically incapable of such things. It's science, folks.
How dare you?
Oh, I dare, you little sack of brain laundry. By the way, this wasn't a concern, folks, at all. No one was concerned about Hunter Biden's involvement in Burisma. It's simply a conspiracy theory. It's nope, not a word. No one in the White House possibly knew. There's no way Joe knew. They were only having meetings in the White House. You don't think at that point somebody said to Joe, "Hey, you should probably have a conversation with your kid about a sketchy fucking business dealings." But no, none of this happened. Rachel Maddow said this was a conspiracy theory, and so it must be true. All right, let's get back to reality here for a minute. reality of the situation is there absolutely was a White House meeting in January of 2016 while Obama was president, while Joe Biden was vice president, while Hunter Biden was making an exorbitant amount of money for no reason whatsoever into Ukraine. And the Ukrainian prosecutors and embassy officials did go to that White House meeting. And we all know how rare those are. Zelensky's been looking for one to this day, according to the Democrats. So how is this possible if these embassy officials and these prosecutors got a meeting in the White House if there was absolutely nothing to be concerned about related to Burisma, Joe, and Hunter Biden? How is that possible? Obviously, it's not. There's no way that this was possible. And the fact that they were not only getting meetings, but getting meetings in the White House specifically means Joe had to know about it. And the fact that the whistleblower was the guy that signed all of these people in means that not only did he know about it, but he was probably worried about getting dragged into this because he was also a bit of a policy expert in the Ukraine, supposedly. He was working for the NSC, which H.R. McMaster managed to gather all of the anti-Trumpers and Obama layovers into that one organization for some reason. And he just so happens to be buddies with good old John Brennan, former director of the CIA, who may very well have started the entirety of the Russian collusion hoax single-handedly. Now, the Dems will claim that they looked into it and that it was dismissed as corrupt misinformation from corrupt elements in Ukraine or Russia, or they vetted the situation and 17 bureaucratic bullshit artists will emerge and declare that it was all on the up and up, like they did with the ICA, the Intelligence Community Assessment, which was all based on the dossier, which we all know is full of nothing but fucking bullshit. And to top it all off, the whistleblower, like I said, was the one that checked all of these people into the White House per official White House visitor logs. This is not me saying it. This is not Ingraham saying it. It's not Kenneth Vogel saying it. Official White House visitor logs put all of those Ukrainian officials, Eric Ciaramella, the whistleblower, and White House staff in a room to discuss Hunter Biden. They all knew, and the whistleblower knew probably more than most, having been a supposed expert in Ukraine and being the one who physically signed in and having intelligence community ties. And he knew his name was going to get tied into this eventually. And thanks to Laura Ingraham, that day is today, even though Laura Ingram's team wouldn't use it. One of these people, by the way, that was in this meeting was Andrei Teleshenko. I told you, remember that name? He was approached by Alexandra Chalupa of the Atlantic Council, who was working with the DNC to find, quote, Russian dirt on Trump. He also blew the whistle on her, and suddenly he's a conspiracy theorist pushing fake Russian propaganda. But the whistleblower who blew the whistle on Trump on a perfect phone call, he's a hero, even though I can only assume is trapped in Adam Schiff's basement currently because he's a freaking ghost all of a sudden. Had a lot to say about the president, had a lot to say about this call, but now nowhere to be found, not a peep out of him, still working for the NSC, who just leaked the manuscript of John Bolton's book to the New York Times. Just throwing all that out there. Seems a little strange and possibly a coincidence, but definitely a conspiracy theory. So did he blow the whistle on Trump because Trump was uncovering all of this Ukrainian corruption? And for that matter, how well did this guy know Joe Biden? Like, why would he stick his neck out for Joe Biden? Fuck Joe Biden, right? Like, most people could give a shit. I wouldn't piss on him if he was on fire. But Joe Biden and this guy have a long history of working together, it turns out. The alleged whistleblower, Eric Ciaramella, was a Biden guest at a State Department banquet, according to a Washington Examiner article from November of 2019. And I quote, Biden co-hosted the banquet with former Secretary of State John Kerry for then Italian Prime Minister Matteo Renzi. Ciaramella, who is of Italian heritage, sidebar, as if you couldn't tell from his last name, back into the article, who was among the U.S. officials who accepted an invitation. This week, the Washington Examiner reported that Ciaramella is now a deputy national intelligence officer for Russia and Eurasia on the National Intelligence Council, reporting to the Director of National Intelligence. Ciaramella, a career CIA analyst, was Ukrainian director on the National Security Council during the end of the Obama administration and remained there during the early months of the Trump administration when he was briefly acting senior director for European and Russian affairs. He is now accused of being the official who filed the complaint about a July 25th phone call in which President Trump urged Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky to look into a conspiracy theory regarding CrowdStrike and investigate Biden, a Democrat candidate for president in 2020, in relation to his son Hunter Biden's dealings in Ukraine. End quote. Well, it also turns out there's a little bit more of a connection between Joe and Eric Ciaramella, the alleged, I put that in quotes, he's an alleged whistleblower in that people are alleging that he actually blew the whistle on anything. That's sort of how I feel about it whenever I say alleged whistleblower. But another article from the Washington Examiner, October 2019, Joe Biden worked with whistleblower when he was vice president, officials reveal. And I quote, Michael Atkinson, the Intelligence Community Inspector General, told members of Congress that the whistleblower had a, quote, professional tie, end quote, to a 2020 Democratic candidate. He had written earlier that while the whistleblower's complaint was credible, he had shown, quote, some indicia of an arguable political bias in favor of a rival political candidate, end quote. And another end quote. I think that's two end quotes. Neither here nor there. Atkinson is the only one of the testimonies. This is Michael Atkinson, the ICIG, the Intelligence Community's Inspector General. He's the guy that took the whistleblower complaint, and we got more on that in a second too. But he is also the only one of the 18 witnesses that testified in closed-door hearings for the House that deposition has not been released yet. You may notice over and over again the House managers and people in the media talking about 17 witnesses. They had 17 witnesses in the House. That is technically false. They had 18 witnesses in the House, and one of those testimonies was from Intelligence Community Inspector General Michael Atkinson, where I'm sure several questions were asked about why this guy's complaint was ever taken into consideration, being that it's not a first-hand complaint. And up to that point, there had actually been a statute in place that said that any information that comes on behalf of a whistleblower needs to be first-hand information and not, hearsay, essentially, because that starts the telephone game inside the intelligence community, a group of people that are already fucking paranoid to begin with. So now, if Eric just told his buddy, and that buddy told somebody else, and that person told a third person, and that person can go blow the whistle, no one's held accountable for what actually was stated in that complaint. Anybody can say just about anything, and sure enough, the Intelligence Community Inspector General Michael Atkinson actually loosened up the rules in order to allow Eric Ciaramella's complaint. Is that the standard used to be that it would be only first-hand accounts could be used as whistleblower complaints, and Eric Ciaramella, the supposed alleged whistleblower, the alleged supposed whistleblower, I guess is probably the best way of putting it, he hands in his complaint. It is not first-hand information. And what does the ICIG do? Well, they change the rules to allow third-party whistleblower complaints and retroactively allow this complaint, which was filed before the rule was changed, which would mean potentially that this is, in fact, the first official third-party whistleblower complaint in the history of the intelligence community, and it finds itself suddenly at the center of an impeachment hoax. None of that seems weird to you? I mean, take a good hard look at that. The first ever official third-party whistleblower complaint in the history of the intelligence community just so happened to not only be allowed, but it went back and retroactively allowed after a rule was changed, presumably specifically for the allowance of this whistleblower complaint. And now that third-party whistleblower complaint, in all likelihood, again, the first ever officially recognized third-party whistleblower complaint in the history of the intelligence community, is suddenly at the center of the impeachment nonsense. Really? That doesn't seem weird to anybody? Anyway, I've got an article from Sean Davis of The Federalist from September of 2019 talking about that very rule change. That'll be in the show notes for you if you'd like to get a little bit more background on that. But I also wanted to give you a little bit of background on Michael Atkinson, the Intelligence Community's Inspector General. Michael Atkinson had also in the past worked as senior counsel to John Carlin and Mary McCord. You're like, who the hell are those people? Well, I'm about to tell you. Let's go ladies first. Mary McCord actually ended up replacing John Carlin in his role as the Assistant Attorney General for the Department of Justice National Security Division. She was involved in the setup of Michael Flynn, who is to this day still fighting the case, and the prosecutors had initially said that because he was fighting it that they were going to now consider jail time, but due to the information that was submitted by his attorney, Sidney Powell, it looks like they are now no longer looking for jail time, and now they want to try to let him go with just probation, which is laughable. When you read the deposition that was presented by his attorney, it basically shows that in every conceivable way the FBI has violated their plea deal with him, and so he wants to now fight it because he's realized that they had withheld a bunch of information that would have exonerated him, but they kept it to themselves. A theme, as we've seen in the FBI, and the FBI still has not retracted its statement that Michael Flynn was not being purposefully untruthful in their conversation, which is precisely what he ultimately ended up pleading guilty to. Many people ask why. Why would one do that? Why would one plead guilty to a charge that they were not guilty of? Well, it seems sometimes that the deck is stacked against you, as it certainly was against Michael Flynn, in addition to the fact that they were suggesting prosecuting his son and other close people to him if he didn't cooperate with them in trying to complete their narrative that obviously the Trump campaign, Mr. Flynn included, were coordinating with the Russians in some roundabout sort of way. Miss McCord, getting back to her, Mary McCord now works as a top outside counsel for, and you're never going to believe this, Adam Schiff's House Intelligence Community team. Yeah, that's just a coincidence, I'm sure, and she rarely makes any sorts of public addresses these days, but one of the few that she has made was with Grandmaster collusion hoaxer Michael Isikoff of Yahoo News on the Yahoo Skullduggery podcast. And for those of you unaware of Michael Isikoff's involvement in all this sort of stuff, he is the guy who Christopher Steele used to launder his own information and make it seem legitimate. He was the guy that Christopher Steele gave information to from the dossier. Michael Isikoff then wrote an article about the dossier, and then about the information, rather not the dossier, about the information that Steele gave him. And then when the dossier information was submitted to the FISA court, one of the footnotes that was used to source some of the dossier information, to corroborate some of the dossier information, was this Yahoo News article, which ultimately came from the same source, which was Christopher Steele and the dossier information. And I'm sure that's all just a coincidence. But let me get back to General Flynn here for just a second, as he was, of course, interviewed by Peter Strzok, one of the two famous lovers of the FBI now, him and Lisa Page, as well as Joe Pianka. Now, we all know how sketchy Peter Strzok was at this point. And then there was Pianka, who reviewed the FISA warrants for the FBI. That was his job, was to review the FISA warrants and verify them before they went forward to the FISA court. Clearly, he did not do his job on that front. And he's another one of these characters, much like the whistleblower, much like Joseph Mifsud, that like a whisper in the night, poof, vanished, disappeared, like a ghost, gone, vamoose, nowhere to be found. Very, very strange. Now, Mary McCord, leaving as the Assistant Attorney General for the National Security Division of the DOJ and going to Adam Schiff's team, maybe that's just a coincidence. Sure, let's get over to John Carlin, who was, prior to Mary McCord, the Assistant Attorney General for the Department of Justice National Security Division under Barack Obama. He knew Carter Page was not a Russian asset. He knew it, undeniably. And yet he held that information to himself and allowed the FISA warrant process to continue. How do we know that he knew that Carter Page was not a Russian agent? Well, because he was involved in the prosecution of one of the Russians, Yevgeny Burakov, who was arrested based on Carter Page's intel that was provided to the CIA, because Carter Page was one of the good guys and was framed as looking like one of the bad guys. Now, Carlin hid that information. He even attended the FISA warrant hearings that were being held in relation to the Carter Page dossiers and just kept that to himself. Oh, and he just so happened to be the former chief of staff for Robert Mueller. Can't make this stuff up, folks. Speaking of Mueller, you are never going to believe this. The fake Ukrainian whistleblower, the alleged supposed whistleblower, Eric Ciaramella, was mentioned in a footnote in the Mueller report. I know. It's crazy. Recently discussed by Laura Ingraham on her Fox News show, but happened to be written about by Paul Sperry of Real Clear Investigations back in October 30th of 2019, and I quote, "In May 2017, Ciaramella went, quote, outside his chain of command, end quote, according to a former NSC coworker, to send an email alerting another agency that Trump happened to hold a meeting with Russian diplomats in the Oval Office the day after firing Comey, who led the Trump-Russia investigation. The email also noted that Russian President Vladimir Putin had phoned the president a week earlier. Contents of the email appeared to have ended up in the media, which reported Trump boasted to Russian officials about firing Comey, whom he allegedly called crazy, a real nutjob. By the way, he is crazy, he is a real nutjob, and whether or not he may have made this comment to Russians is neither nefarious, immoral, unethical, or in any way illegal, nor is it really nefarious." Getting back to the article. In effect, Ciaramella helped generate the Putin fired Comey narrative, according to the research dossier making the rounds in Congress, a copy of which was obtained by Real Clear Investigations. Ciaramella allegedly argued that, quote, President Putin suggested that President Trump fire Comey, end quote, the report said. Quote again, in the days after Comey's firing, this presidential action was used to further political and media calls for the stand-up of the special counsel to investigate Russian collusion. In the end, special counsel Mueller found no conspiracy between Trump and Putin. Ciaramella's email was cited in a footnote in his report, which mentions only Ciaramella's name, the date, and recipients, quote, Kelly et al., end quote. So John Kelly, the then President Chief of Staff, was amongst the people that was emailed about this. And one last sentence here from the article. Former colleagues said that the main recipient was then Homeland Security Director John Kelly, end quote. So that's from the article from Real Clear Investigations from Paul Sperry, who's actually the guy who outed the whistleblower in the first place, but he's talking about specifically the footnote in the Mueller report that references an email from Ciaramella to John Kelly stating that President Trump was told to fire Comey by President Putin. Obviously, none of that turned out to be true, so that would make this guy's second whistleblowing complaint that is just verifiably false. Actually, earlier in that same article was a little blurb here worth note, and I quote, with Ciaramella's name long under wraps, interest in the intelligence analyst is so high that a handful of former colleagues have compiled a roughly 40-page research dossier on him. Haha. So I like it when dossiers go back the other way. Anyway, going on, a classified version of the document is circulating on Capitol Hill and briefings have been conducted based on it. One briefed Republican has been planning to unmask the whistleblower in a speech on the House floor. Wonder who that is. Now, this is October of 2019, so I'm going to go ahead and assume that House representative was Jim Jordan, who was adamant about trying to get the name of the whistleblower on the record during the House hearings, had called out Adam Schiff for pretending that he didn't know who it was, and has been pretty vocal about the fact that this whistleblower is not, in fact, a whistleblower, but more likely a deep state hack, as I've shown a litany of connections to other deep state hacks up to this point. But let's get back to Ciaramella for a second here. Ciaramella held the positions of National Security Council Director for Ukraine under Susan Rice and Director of Baltic and Eastern European Affairs in the office of the Vice President, Joe Biden. He's no dummy when it comes to what's going on in Ukraine. He's not just some random schlub who happens to work in the White House. Ciaramella was detailed to the White House by former CIA Director and Russiagate puppeteer John Brennan in the summer of 2016. Mike Cernovich reports, and I quote, in fall of 2016, as Obama's director for Ukraine on the NSC, Ciaramella was the main force pushing Trump-Russia conspiracy theories, and quote, National Security Advisor H.R. McMaster appointed Ciaramella a former Susan Rice aide to his personal aide, giving him unfettered access to McMaster's conversations with foreign leaders. Now, McMaster has been loading up the NSC with Obama layovers and anti-Trumpers, and eventually Trump fired him in April of 2018. Now, where did Ciaramella go when McMaster left? It's actually hard to track, but here he is today, or at least where he was as of November of 2019, according to the Washington Examiner. And I quote, Eric Ciaramella, who was named by one outlet last week as the whistleblower, is now a deputy national intelligence officer for Russia and Eurasia on the National Intelligence Council, reporting to the Director of National Intelligence. And during the Obama administration and the start of the Trump administration, Ciaramella was Ukraine director on the National Security Council, the post Vindman now holds. That's, of course, Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vindman, one of the other star witnesses for the Democrats in the House hearing. It's almost like these people all know each other and all have a common goal of doing anything they can to screw over our president. It's hard to argue otherwise, and feel free to try at Right Opinion Pod or the Right Opinion Pod at gmail.com. Also worth note, before I move on too far past McMaster, let's not forget that under his tenure, there were leaks of full-blown verbatim transcripts of Trump's conversations with not only the Australian Prime Minister, but also the President of Mexico. And it gets even better, or should I say worse. According to the Washington Examiner has reported that 2 ex-NXC staffers are now employed by Schiff. Weird. Abigail Grace, who worked at the NSC until 2018, was hired in February, while Sean Misko, an NSC aide until 2017, joined Schiff's committee staff in August, the same month the whistleblower submitted his complaint. So these two people happen to work for McMaster in the NSC, and they had developed a friendship, Misko, Grace, and for that matter, Ciaramella. Ciaramella still working for the White House, Misko and Grace working for Adam Schiff, as this was all happening in August when the whistleblower, Ciaramella, filed his complaint. And it is later found out that he had communicated with Schiff's team before the complaint was filed. Schiff himself also happens to deny having spoken to the whistleblower, but as we know, Adam Schiff denies reality virtually all the time, so who actually knows? At the very least, I would think it's safe to say that even if Schiff didn't speak to the whistleblower directly, that he was certainly doing so through the proxies of Misko and or Grace. But wait, there's more. The whistleblower, Ciaramella, was overheard in 2017 discussing with an ally how to remove Trump, according to Paul Sperry, Real Clear Investigations, January 22nd, 2020. And I quote from the article, which will be in the show notes. And I quote, sources told Real Clear Investigations the staffer with whom Ciaramella was speaking was Sean Misko. Yes, that's Sean Misko. Both were Obama administration holdovers working in the Trump White House on foreign policy and national security issues. And both expressed anger over Trump's new, quote, America First, end quote, foreign policy, a sea change from Obama's approach to international affairs. Just days after he was sworn in, they were already talking about trying to get rid of him, said a White House colleague who overheard their conversation. They weren't just bent on subverting his agenda, the former official added. They were plotting to actually have him removed from office. Misko left the White House last summer to join House impeachment manager Adam Schiff's committee, where sources say he offered, quote, guidance to the whistleblower, who has been officially identified only as an intelligence officer in a complaint against Trump filed under whistleblower laws. Misko then helped run the impeachment inquiry based on the complaint as a top investigator for congressional diplomats. And that was in 2017. A long time before the Ukrainian call. Also, getting back to Obama administration's knowledge of the Burisma-Biden conflict, in February of 2016, a month after the White House meeting where Ciaramella signed in all those Ukrainians, and a month before the prosecutor had been fired because Joe Biden said so, Hunter Biden's Ukraine gas firm pressed Obama administration to end corruption allegations, memos show. This is from JohnSolomonReports.com under that headline. And I quote, during the February 2016 contact, a U.S. representative for Burisma Holdings sought a meeting with Undersecretary of State Catherine A. Novelli, to discuss ending the corruption allegations against the Ukrainian firm where Hunter Biden worked as a board member, according to the memos obtained under a Freedom of Information Act lawsuit. And John Solomon adds, I filed that suit this summer with the help of the public interest law firm, the Southeastern Legal Foundation. Continuing on with the article. Just 3 weeks before Burisma's overture to state, Ukrainian authorities raided the home of the oligarch who owned the gas firm and employed Hunter Biden, a signal the long-running corruption probe was escalating in the middle of the U.S. presidential election. Hunter Biden's name, in fact, was specifically invoked by the Burisma representative as a reason the State Department should help, according to a series of emails exchanged among U.S. officials trying to arrange the meeting. The subject line for the emails exchanged read simply, quote, Burisma. And I quote, per our conversation, Karen Tramontano of Blue Star Strategies requested a meeting to discuss with Undersecretary Novelli remarks alleging Burisma of corruption. A February 24, 2016 email between state officials read, goes on to say, and I quote, she noted that 2 high-profile U.S. citizens are affiliated with the company, end quote. And one of them was, of course, Hunter Biden. Tramontano would like to talk with Undersecretary Novelli about getting a better understanding of how the U.S. came to the determination that the company is corrupt. The email added, according to Tramontano, there is no evidence of corruption, has been no hearing or process, and evidence to the contrary has not been considered, end quote. So they're saying there's no corruption, there's no hearing or process, that there hasn't been evidence to the contrary that hasn't been considered, but they also led with Hunter Biden. They were like, hey, by the way, you know, your vice president's son works over here. There's nothing to see here, guys. What are you doing? Stop. You're being silly, America. Y'all are crazy. Anyway, so Biden gets the prosecutor fired, Shokin. Later, his approved guy is put into place. Yuri Lutsenko is the gentleman's name. He is now the supposedly uncorrupt prosecutor put in place to fill in for the supposedly corrupt prosecutor in Viktor Shokin. Lutsenko had some things to say, and we'll talk about them. But first, from the Kiev Post again, and I quote, however, despite considerable public attention, the illicit enrichment of Zlochevsky was never properly investigated and sent to the court. In 2 years, the investigation mystically transformed into the case of tax evasion by chief accountant of one of the Burisma Holdings companies. This was done under Yuri Lutsenko's leadership at the PGO. In the same criminal proceeding into alleged illicit enrichment in October of 2016, Prosecutor General's Office investigators asked the State Fiscal Service to hold up an unscheduled tax audit of Esko Pivinich, LLC, one of the companies of Burisma Holdings. So Burisma holds a bunch of different companies. This is one of them. And the investigation miraculously shifted from Zlochevsky, who founded Burisma, to this random accountant at Esko Pivinich, LLC. The article goes on, the audit concerned the period of 8 months of 2016 and established some violations. As a result, the chief accountant of the company was declared a scapegoat and notified of suspicion of tax evasion. The accountant paid outstanding taxes as prescribed by the audit, thus eliminating the grounds for criminal charges and tax evasion. The amount paid by the accountant constituted 50 million UAH, which is, I guess, their currency, about $1.9 million American, which was only a fraction of the alleged evasion. However, this resulted also in closure in November 2016 of the criminal proceedings regarding possible illicit enrichment and money laundering allegedly committed by Zlochevsky. Available information shows no logic to the actions of PGO investigators who combined the episode of companies' tax evasion in 2016 with the criminal proceedings on illicit enrichment and money laundering allegedly committed by Zlochevsky in 2010 to 2014. So the investigation into Zlochevsky was still going on as late as November of 2016. Did something happen in 2016 in November? Anything? Anything at all? Oh, yeah. Donald Trump was elected president, which may very well have been why Joe Biden chose to spend one of his last 3 days as the vice president visiting the Ukraine. Just an idea, just throwing it out there. Before I move on, I want to add some more late-breaking news regarding Viktor Shokin. He has apparently filed a formal complaint with Ukrainian's National Bureau of Investigation, which is different from NABU, the National Anti-Corruption Bureau of Ukraine, and he specifically filed this complaint about Biden. The complaint reads, and I quote, "Throughout the last months of 2015 and the first months of 2016, Joseph Biden, taking advantage of his position, came several times on official visits to Ukraine in order to negotiate with the leaders of the country my eviction and, consequently, the closing of the objective investigation into the offenses committed by persons associated with the company Burisma Holdings Limited, which is based out of Cyprus, including the son of the aforementioned U.S. official," end quote. Shokin's filing continues. And I quote, "Due to continued pressure from the Vice President of the United States, Joseph Biden, to oust me from the job by blackmailing the allocation of financial assistance, I, as the man who places the state interest above my personal interest, I agreed to abandon the post of Prosecutor General of Ukraine," end quote. After he further claims the, quote, "active investigation," end quote, into Burisma was dropped and the, quote, "the persons implicated in these offenses were not identified nor arrested or charged," end quote. Shokin continues his filing by asserting that Biden's quid pro quo, quote, "represents interference in the internal affairs of Ukraine on the part of a foreign power in violation of one of the principles of international law," end quote. And for that matter, let me interject, true. Continuing from there, and I quote, "Thus the unlawful influence exerted on me as the head of a judicial structure in the country by Joseph Biden, who abused his power as the Vice President of the United States in order to prevent me from carrying out my duties as the Prosecutor General of Ukraine, thus preventing me from solving serious crimes and arresting the persons who committed those crimes, has the characteristics of the crime stipulated in Article 343, Part 2 of the Criminal Code of Ukraine," end quote. He writes. And so, based on these facts, Shokin concludes an investigation ought to be launched immediately to look into Biden. I have a little article about all this in the show notes. And so, like I said at the top of the show, tell you what I'm going to tell you, and then tell you what I told you. All of these people know each other. Biden was obviously involved in, at the very least, to be as friendly and generous as possible, a conflict of interest in Ukraine. His son making a boatload of money, and he's not the only Biden making a boatload of money, although he is the only Biden, to my knowledge, making a boatload of money in Ukraine. Keep an ear out for that future episode about the Biden crime family. But you got Biden and his son clearly involved in some sketchy stuff going on in Ukraine. Clearly a very muddy series of waters that's very hard to navigate, even for people who are somewhat familiar with the players here. You've got all of these folks, including the whistleblower, who are doing absolutely everything they can to discredit anything that points towards this corruption as a conspiracy theory, and for that matter, doing everything they can to point out things that are being done by the Trump administration, which they claim are bad, which are actually things that they had previously done, or they're just accusing him of doing things that they had actually done. Either way, you've got Biden and his connections to Ciaramella. You've got the Inspector General and the ICIG, the Intelligence Community Inspector General Michael Atkinson, who certainly got some stake in the game here, changed some rules just to allow the whistleblower complaint to come through. Atkinson had been working for John Carlin, who had been involved in the FISA warrant process on Michael Flynn, as well as Mary McCord, who had been involved in all of this and didn't say a peep about any of this as Michael Flynn was having the book thrown at him for a crime he didn't commit. You've got Joe Pianka and Peter Strzok, who had interviewed Michael Flynn. Strzok is obviously as sketchy as it comes, and they are doing everything they can to hide Pianka before we find out any dirt on him. And then the whistleblower, not only knowing Biden and knowing Brennan and all that sort of stuff, but signing in Ukrainian officials in January of 2016 into the White House to discuss the fact that Hunter Biden was working for a company that was definitely sketchy, the arrangement was sketchy, the founder and owner of the company was sketchy, and that they were looking into it, and they wanted to discuss with the White House how to handle this because the vice president's son was involved. But nothing to see here, folks. All that's just verified through media reports and documents. But alas, I'm a conspiracy theorist. I am, after all, wearing my tinfoil hat at the moment. So, all of that aside, I just beat you over the head with an hour and 40 minutes of stuff about all of that. Let's get into a couple other quick hits, and then I'm sending you home John Bolton. So this whole nonsense about John Bolton, thankfully, there are good conservatives out there on the Republican side who managed to just put this thing to bed. And those gentlemen just so happen to be Ted Cruz and Lindsey Graham. So just to give you a recap, John Bolton was a national security advisor to the president. At the time, both left and right questioned that move. And it appears that whenever John Bolton was actually trying to implement his war-hawking policies, Donald Trump was ignoring him and then ultimately ousted him as a result, as we saw recently in his tweet. He said if it was up to Bolton, we'd be on World War VI by now, which completely went over the heads of all those people who still think we're in the middle of World War III. So he's trying to sell this book. The Room Where It Happened is the name of the book. The book needed to go to the NSC to be screened to make sure that there was no confidential or secret or top secret information in there. And it just so happens that the leaky sieve known as the National Security Council, not exactly the most reassuring quality to have for an organization of that importance, but they leaked this transcript to the New York Times, or at least leaked, testimonials of people who supposedly read this manuscript to the New York Times. As in the New York Times, they never actually quote much of the manuscript at all, but they suggest all of these things, like Bolton was in the room at the time when Trump made it perfectly clear that this investigation needed to be announced before any military aid was ultimately released to the Ukrainians. Now, I want to thank Ted Cruz and Lindsey Graham for nipping this in the bud, because essentially what they did is, rather than go through the whole rigmarole of seeing if the 4 Republicans who are considering witnesses might actually leap at it, opening a whole Pandora's box of just nonsense that just didn't need to be done because the House didn't make their case, and that's why there didn't need to be any further witnesses, because it wouldn't matter at this point. They don't have a case. They don't even have charges, really. They're trying to impeach the president based on hurt feelings and policy disputes and trying to spin that into a high crime or a misdemeanor. It's lunacy. But what Cruz and Graham did is they wrote a question on one of the final days of the hearings. They do questions. So you write a question, you hand it up to the Supreme Court Justice, who just so happens to be Chief Justice Roberts right now, John Roberts. He reads the questions to whoever they may be directed at, either the President's counsel or the House managers. So they write a question that says, okay, let's assume, I think this is, they referred to this as arguendo. And if you're not listening to Verdict with Ted Cruz, it's the #1 podcast in the country, or at least it was when I last listened to it. You're missing out. You're missing out on a lot of really good information. The same goes, for that matter, for the Dan Bongino podcast. If you guys aren't already listening to it, check it out, the Dan Bongino Show, or Verdict with Ted Cruz. 2 just wells of information if you're willing to go and lower the bucket down and see what you might pull up. But what Cruz and Graham did is they asked a question, and the question was essentially, okay, let's assume everything John Bolton's said, or supposedly said, in accordance to this New York Times article is true. Let's say that there actually was a quid pro quo. Does that make this an impeachable offense? And the president's counsel got up and said, no, obviously that's not the case. Quid pro quos happen literally all the time in foreign policy, which is nice, because here's the deal. I don't even think they could prove a quid pro quo if they absolutely had to, and they didn't. And even with Bolton's testimony, I don't know that that's really, first of all, we don't know what Bolton actually said in that book. We don't know what he would actually say if he was on the stand. It's a whole lot different when you're writing a book than when you're sitting in front of Congress under oath. So we don't know what he might have said. Even if he had said whatever he said, it still doesn't necessarily prove that there was a quid pro quo, because a disgruntled ex-employee came in and testified to that fact. But for the sake of argument, Cruz and Graham said, let's just assume you guys are right. Let's assume that the president did conduct a quid pro quo. Would that be impeachable? And would that matter? And the counsel, like I said, President's counsel argued, no, that happens all the time in foreign policy. We give out money to people. We expect them to meet certain conditions. In this case, the president had run on, President Zelensky had run, and for that matter, President Trump had run on an anti-corruption agenda, and he wanted to make sure that they were going to follow through on it before he gave them $1 billion. It's not unreasonable It's not irrational, and it's most certainly not exclusively for his personal gain there. The world is a better place when other countries are less corrupt. It seems to reason that if you want Ukraine, one of the more corrupt countries, to be less corrupt, dangling $1 billion over their head to do so isn't the end of the world. For instance, Joe Biden did just that. Now, the difference is that Joe Biden's son was involved in the mess at the time, and he actually had a far greater personal interest than just potentially an upcoming election. He could very well have been, involved in some serious corruption that could have involved him being ousted as the vice president if any of this stuff ever came to light. Obama likes Biden. Let's not pretend like Obama likes Biden more than Obama likes Obama, okay? If he thought for 1 second that Joe Biden was going to ruin his presidency, Joe Biden would have been out on the curb. And frankly, it didn't matter anyway because Obama was the one who was carrying that ticket one way or the other. And he wasn't up for re-election at that point anyway. So rather than open up the floodgates and have all of the potential witnesses, the one that seemed to be of the most interest to anybody on the right, at least, was John Bolton. And those few people that were considering voting for witnesses just to hear John Bolton, well, they were put at ease a little bit by Ted Cruz's question as well as Lindsey Graham's question when they asked, okay, let's assume that everything we read in this New York Times article is correct and John Bolton's telling the absolute truth. Is that impeachable? And the argument was made clearly, no, it is not. Because this sort of thing happens all the time. It's actually how foreign policy is run. This is the same sort of thing that Mick Mulvaney was saying in that infamous press conference that everyone seems to think is this damning information when all he's doing is cutting through the bullshit. And frankly, I love our president. I think that's pretty clear at this point. But him continuously saying that he didn't do this when, in actuality, again, I don't think he did. And I don't think that the transcript shows that. And the transcript is the number one most crucial piece of evidence to all of this. It would have been a much easier defense for him if he had just said, yeah, I did a quid pro quo, whatever you guys want to call it. We just call it foreign policy. We do it all the time and give you examples of past administrations that have done just that. And for that matter, instances where I've done it prior to this and none of you seem to mind. As a matter of fact, the supposed Middle East peace deal is essentially a quid pro quo. Is that you guys do this, we'll do that, and hopefully all of you will stop killing each other. Or at least take it down a notch. Anyway, as I mentioned with the whole Bolton thing, conveniently, this manuscript was leaked from the NSC, where Ciaramella still has some connections, I'm sure. And for that matter, the NSC, as I mentioned prior, is just the leaky sieve, man. It is just really bad. The National Security Council seems to leak more stuff than WikiLeaks, for that matter. It's really rough. And the timing wasn't even remotely suspicious, of course. Just as the Democrats' case had completely fallen apart, it appeared that none of the Republicans were going to vote for any additional witnesses, and then this Bolton bombshell comes out, and no one seems to think that there's anything shady about that at all. It's not like we haven't seen the exact same play run during the Kavanaugh hearings in the form of one Julie Swetnick. So congratulations, Mr. Bolton. You are now the new Julie Swetnick, who is, of course, the woman who accused Brett Kavanaugh of being a gang rapist at the behest of soon-to-be jailbird Michael Avenatti. And hopefully, who knows, maybe we'll see a few more jailbirds as a result of all of this. Moving on. One little thing, not so political, but I had to talk about it. It's cultural, it makes a lot of sense. Jillian Michaels is a fitness expert of sorts. I actually have, I think I have a workout DVD of hers somewhere. Somebody gave me a while back when I was actually trying to get myself in shape. She made some comments recently. By the way, I'm in much better shape now, and I don't think Jillian Michaels helped me one bit. But Jillian Michaels was on some BuzzFeed show for some reason talking about health and fitness, and somebody brought up Lizzo, who some of you may know, and Lord knows I hope most of you don't, is some obese, pop star these days. She's obese. There's really no way of dancing around it. If you've ever seen her, that is basically the definition of obese. But she's also one of these body image nuts, and she's so proud of her big figure and this, that, and the other thing. Well, this lady from BuzzFeed had Jillian Michaels on and got to talking about Lizzo and got to talking about her body positivity and all this sort of stuff. It's like here on one hand you have obese pop singer and on the other hand you have fitness instructor. How she thought Jillian Michaels would react to this, I don't know. But here is what Jillian Michaels had to say that she obviously received some lashback about. Here it goes.
Why are we celebrating her body? Why does it matter? That's what I'm saying. Why aren't we celebrating her music? because it isn't going to be awesome if she gets diabetes.
Well, I want to ask you.
I'm just being honest. Like, I love her music. Like, my kid loves her music. But there's never a moment where I'm like, and I'm so glad that she's overweight. Like, why do I even care?
Yeah, that's a good question. Why do you even care to begin with? I don't think Lizzo's particularly talented, in addition to the fact that she's obviously not in very good shape. But this whole notion of body positivity, look, body positivity is one thing. Like, you got a couple extra lbs here, you got, like a lazy eye, you got some crooked teeth, like whatever. I mean, these are things that could probably be fixed with some money and some time, and you would fix them if you could. Let's not pretend you wouldn't. But this notion of, like, we need to glorify this obese pop star because she's willing to wear skimpy clothing that the rest of us have no desire to see her in is ridiculous. And the fact that some idiot from BuzzFeed, I mean, this had to be a troll job, right? Like, the person from BuzzFeed had to know this was going to set Jillian Michaels, health professional, off. Like, this is a woman who spends her life trying to get people into better shape, not to glorify people who are in terrible shape. We already have an obesity epidemic in this country. Why in God's name would we continue to glorify people who are clearly obese, many of which can control it? There's only but so much that you could control through diet, but you can't control some of that through diet. You can also control some of it through exercise. You can also control some of it through just general lifestyle choices. And oh, by the way, if you're like a big girl, it's cool. There's somebody out there who's into you. I got plenty of friends who like women who are a little bit oversized. The rest of us do not want to see you in spandex, in bikinis, and all this other stuff. And to quote Jillian Michaels, yeah, it's not going to be very cool if you get diabetes. What kind of message does that send to the Lizzo fans out there? To the obese teenagers who might look up to her and think, oh, there's somebody who looks like me, and that's great, and that's wonderful. I personally don't understand this whole concept of you need somebody to look like you. Like, most of the posters on my wall when I was a kid were 7 foot tall athletic black men. Not exactly what I look like, for those of you unaware. I don't understand this whole notion of representation. Having said that, the argument can be made I'm white and I'm privileged and I'm unaware of these types of qualms, like whatever. There's been plenty of fictional characters and athletes and celebrities and role models of all colors for all people to look up to. If you're just looking for somebody who looks like you, go look in a mirror. By the way, that person, probably not all that great. Anyway, so Jillian Michaels doing this whole diabetes, line here, and people are like, oh my God, how could you say that? Because it's reality, folks. This woman needs to stop showing off her body and start taking care of it. And Jillian Michaels is the type of person who could help her with that. But alas, I have no doubt that she will not be taking Miss Michaels' calls at any point in the foreseeable future because, well, body positivity. Likelihood is, by the way, she will end up with some sort of condition because when you're that big, heart conditions, cholesterol, diabetes, all of these things are vastly more likely to happen to you when you're not only big, but as big as Lizzo is. And that brings me to the conclusion of this show here. One last thing. These people think you're dumb, folks. These folks on CNN, they think you're dumb. I was going to say it's the liberals, but one of them claims to be a Republican. Actually wrote a whole article about, I am a Republican. Me and George Conway, Kellyanne's whipping boy over there. Don Lemon, Wajahat Ali, and yes, the Rick Wilson, who thinks he's cool and puts a "the" in front of his name. Lemon, Wajahat, and Wilson have this conversation on CNN. I'm sure you've heard it by now about these people. I don't even want to play the clip because I don't want to give them the time of day, frankly. But these idiots are all sitting around making fun of Trump supporters, claiming that they're dumber than they are and that they look down at elites because of their math and their geography and their ability to read and all this sort of stuff, and that they think, that the dumb people of America looking up at these elitist idiots like these three clowns that are sitting here who perpetually talk down to Americans, pretend that they're smarter than the rest of us. They are every bit the elitist that we claim them to be. And in this very dialogue that these gentlemen had, they proved it in spades. Rick Wilson's big line was, Donald Trump couldn't find Ukraine on a map if there was a letter U and a picture of a physical crane. And this apparently was so funny that it sent ever professional Don Lemon into a friggin' full-blown giggle fit, while Wajahat Ali tried desperately to keep up by tacking on even less funny lines to the existing unfunny lines that were all, by the way, a direct reflection of the whole deplorables comment. So these guys, these three, these fucking bastions of intellectual integrity here, seem to think they're so smart. They are so much smarter than the rest of you, but they will actually sit on national television and make the exact same mistake that actually cost Hillary Clinton the election last time around, which was by pissing off half the country by telling them that they're a bunch of idiots. The deplorables, the irredeemables, and now the anti-elitist elitists, I suppose, according to these clowns, the incredulous boomer rubes, as Rick Wilson referred to us. Yes, these clowns will sit here on a show that no one fucking watches, pretending that they're higher and mightier than the rest of us because they have degrees from schools that, frankly, the rest of us had no fucking interest in going to in the first place because they're not schools, they're indoctrination stations, and these clowns decided to just full-blown display how indoctrinated they are. And again, I wish I could just paintbrush all these idiots as liberals, but unfortunately Rick Wilson claims to be a Republican. And here we are with these three clowns. Now, you get Wajahat Ali, who was barely involved in this conversation. It was mostly Rick Wilson attempting to crack jokes and Don Lemon, who has clearly no sense of humor, laughing at them. Now, Wajahat didn't want to get lost in all this, so he threw a few shots out there himself. And now, after this clip gets retweeted by the president, now he seems to think that the president is threatening him by tweeting a video. Look, clown. You're the idiot who went on national television and made these statements. Did you not think people were going to see it? I mean, granted, you did make these statements on CNN where no one watches anymore, so maybe you did. But guess what? When you make public statements, this is the beauty of the First Amendment, is it allows idiots like Wajahat Ali to expose themselves. This is the one true beauty, the one never talked about beauty of the First Amendment, is that when you give people the freedom to speak, they let you know exactly who they are. And these three elitist ass clowns want to look down their nose at you while they couldn't be more wrong about virtually anything that has come out of their mouths over the course of the last 3 years. But you're an idiot. Sure. Rick Wilson, by the way, is one of the other clowns in this panel here. He was one of the anti-Trump supposed Republicans who wrote that New York Times op-ed, "We Are Republicans," with Kellyanne's husband and a couple other idiots. He's clearly upset that his article did nothing to get Republicans to stray from this president. So he's going to go out on air and he's going to insult our intelligence as if he's done anything intelligent ever. Don Lemon sits there and laughs like he's a 12-year-old girl. Well, maybe he is. Meanwhile, these three, as I mentioned, have been losing virtually every political debate. For the last 4 years, Trump is accomplishing more in a round of 18 than these three have ever done in their collective lives, and the rest of us have tuned these asshats out years ago, which is why they think that they can say inflammatory nonsense like they did on air and no one would actually see it or hear outside of their liberal bubble. Unfortunately for them, the president likes to tweet out stupid stuff like this, where a bunch of elitists like to pretend that they're better than the rest of us, and it got infinitely more exposure than it ever would have in its little corner of CNN where, again, nobody watches. So, good job to those folks. You did a tremendous job of proving you're not an elitist by, in fact, being an elitist and then making a bunch of asinine statements while telling the rest of us that we're dumb. So I'm going to ask you guys again, Democrats, liberals, media hacks, Hollywood elites, big tech czars, anti-Trumpers of any shape or form, if we're so dumb, and if he's so dumb, why do we keep beating you? At a certain point, after a certain number of losses, you'd think that they'd say, you know, this Trump guy is tougher than we thought, which is why he keeps handing us our asses on a daily basis. Maybe we should regroup. Maybe instead of demeaning his supporters, we should find out why they're drawn to him and try to draw them away from him. Nah, let's just go ahead and continuing on with our losing ways because, frankly, we're losers. And that's what they are. That's what they'll continue to be. Frankly, I think it's what they were born to be. These three guys, with all of their upper crust university degrees, thought Hillary Clinton was the right choice to lead our country. Certainly, they didn't think Donald Trump was. Yeah, sorry, intellectual juggernauts. Hard pass on your opinions. As a matter of fact, this is only further evidence of the indoctrination that takes place at these types of universities. These guys are just brainwashed enough to sit back and make the same mistake that Hillary made and are repeating it all over again openly while patting themselves on the back for being so much smarter than the rest of you. Granted, they were on CNN and their audience isn't very bright, but even they had to be smart enough to know that this was going to be shared across other outlets where people might actually watch it. Meanwhile, let me give you an example of just how out of touch that these people are. Here's one of those very elites, not one of these three guys, but someone cut from the same cloth, a regular on CNN, a man who has a JD, that's a doctor of jurisprudence, from Yale, pretty elite sort of place, a man who regularly frequents the cesspool known as CNN, and a man who's been so terribly wrong about a myriad of things over the last 4 years, in addition to helping to accidentally uncover the media's Russia hoax by admitting on hidden camera that the Russian thing was, quote, a nothing burger. Yes, Mr. White Lash himself, Van Jones. Now, Van Jones is usually wrong about American politics, but for the purposes of this clip, it sounds like he's trying out his hand at being wrong with British politics as well. And let's just see how that went for him. Now, mind you, before I play this clip, I talked about the type of globalist nonsense that the Soros crowd likes earlier on in the show. And believe you me, Van Jones and this very speech fits right into that category. This was Van Jones 4 years ago when the Brexit vote first passed.
The UK just voted to leave the European Union, so-called Brexit, Britain exit, Brexit. You haven't cared about it. Nobody cares about it. It's just summertime. We're all happy. This is the end of the world as we know it. Okay? Please take this seriously. What happened? What happened was you have this complete right-wing, crazy, racist, xenophobic horror show that breaks out in the UK. They don't want no immigrants. Does that sound familiar? They don't want multiculturalism. Does that sound familiar? They don't want to have nothing to do with nobody, period, except for people who look just like them, basically white folks in Britain.
And to a certain extent, he's actually right, but just in all the wrong ways. This is the end of the world as we know it, but what Van Jones doesn't seem to realize is that this is a good thing. A country snatching its sovereignty from the mouth of a hungry globalist monster, in this case the EU, is akin to the American Revolution, which was a pretty good thing for not only us, but for the world. And we had to pry ourselves away from the crown. They did it, to their credit, without ever having to fire a single bullet. A truly tremendous accomplishment for Boris Johnson and Nigel Farage. And hopefully this is just the beginning, and the rest of Europe will begin to pull out of this unaccountable bureaucratic panel of elitists like our three chuckle buddies on CNN and like Van Jones over here. And they will return to acting in the best interest of their people, of their culture, of their society, and we'll all be better off for it. Rather than awaiting the approval of a committee of overlords, the British people will be able to act in their best interests, clean up their immigration issues, straighten up their economy, preserve their culture, and stop worrying about the opinions of a tribunal of bullies who want to crack the whip and force them to bend the knee at the altar of globalism. This is not what, an individual country should be worried about. They should be worried about themselves, their people, and how to best its best interests. But alas, the European Union was never about that. It's the Obamacare of unions. I was talking about this with somebody the other day. I was saying, if the United States, like let's say back in 1781, instead of signing the Constitution and all jumping on board and becoming the United States together, let's say that we all just remained separate countries, and there was like 50 countries now. Obviously, there was only 13 at the time, but let's assume that 50 countries formed and that they all became independent countries, which is sort of the idea here, right? We're supposed to have states' rights, but we don't really have them at the level that the founders wanted us to have them. But if those countries went on to establish thousands of years of individual culture and customs and, language, maybe religion, whatever the case may be, and then today we decided, hey, let's try to all be buddies, it would never work. In Europe, you're talking about countries with thousands of years of differences between them. They've developed languages, they've developed identities and cultures and customs and all of these things that are unique to those countries. The idea that they could all somehow work together in a cohesive unit where everyone would benefit is laughable. The idea was always going to be that the Germanys of the world were going to pay for the Greeces of the world. And what benefit is this to Germany, except for the fact that they have more influence in the bureaucratic tribunal that makes all these sorts of decisions? So, yeah, they got to pay for some of Greece's bankruptcy, but they also get a little bit of say in what's going on there. Earlier, I discussed the fact that Ukraine had to put in a special anti-corruption prosecutor's office to look over their existing prosecutor's office because the EU told them they had to. And we clearly saw that there was of no benefit to Ukraine ultimately. So, again, unaccountable, power-hungry bureaucrats making decisions for people that they never have to answer to. The Ukrainians don't ever get a chance to talk to the people in the EU. I mean, yeah, some of the representatives go, but the average everyday person, at least they could go and find a way to get in contact with their president or their local representative. These people are completely detached from their country altogether, and they're making decisions that affect their everyday lives. That's the type of globalism that Donald Trump fears. That's the type of globalism that I fear. It's hard enough to get things done here when our president is a 3.5 hour drive from me. Can you imagine if somebody in Helsinki was making decisions for me? I would never be able to get in touch with them. Not that I could get in touch with the president, but I could get in touch with my governor, my senator, my representative. I could voice my opinion, and those people are at least remotely accountable to me, unlike some shadow organization that sits up in its, ivory tower and tries to make decisions for all of us little people. It's ridiculous. It was never going to work. It doesn't work. And England was at least smart enough to get out of there. And I'm going to leave you with the very speech that Nigel Farage left the EU with, because frankly, I watch a lot of politics, and I probably use the term baller a little too often considering the mundanity of this sort of topic, but man, this is like the most baller shit I think I've ever seen. It's Nigel Farage walking into the EU 4 years after saying that he didn't want to be there at all, 2-3 years after he was actually, I think, appointed to the EU to be the representative for England, telling them the whole way, we're getting out of here. Like, as soon as we can get out of here, we're getting out of here. And they all kind of laughed at him. And now he gets to give you the big old, fuck you, I told you so. And he does so in just magnificent fashion. My God, if I ever get a chance to meet Nigel Farage, I am going to shake his hand and thank him for the 5 minutes that you're about to listen to, because it was tremendous. I've listened to this about 4 or 5 times now, and I pray that there are other countries out there today who have people in their governments or around them that are looking forward to making this very speech on their own terms at some point in the not too distant future in the European Union. I've gone over 2 hours. There's no song this week. There is no song at the end here. I'm just going to leave you with Nigel Farage. But before I do, plugs. Find me right here on therightopinion.podbean.com, iTunes, Google Play, and Stitcher, as well as Hacker Hameen, which is available on pretty much all podcatchers and even Spotify. And then you can check out ratsaladreview.com. Also, just search Rat Salad Review. They are a rock and roll and heavy metal podcast network now. They've expanded just beyond the Rat Salad Review show. They've got a bunch of shows. If you like rock music, you like metal music, these guys know exactly what they're talking about. They've also had the cojones to add the right opinion to their feed, and for that, they deserve some level of applause and perhaps even a 5-star review, a like, a share, and a subscription. That would be awesome. I'd appreciate it if you showed them a little appreciation. Hopefully, that means more networks will come along and say, hey, any chance I can get the right opinion on my feed? And you probably can. You're going to have to just get in touch with me first. Email me, therightopinionpod@gmail.com. You can also find me on Twitter and on Instagram @rightopinionpod. And I think that's just about it. All of the details will be in the show notes. There's also a merch store. I'm working on getting a better alternative. I've actually been working with Wayne Noon over at Rat Salad Review to see if I can get a better outlet for that, but there is merch there. I designed it all myself, so hopefully it comes out looking good, and if not, we will blame the folks at Teespring, but teespring.com has the merch store, and there's a link in the show notes, as well as links to all of the articles that I've mentioned at some point during the show. And I really, if you guys hung in this far, like, I thank you ever so much. It's 2 hours. It's been a lot of information. Hopefully I've given you a couple nuggets to share with your friends, with your enemies, with your political rivals, with the liberal trolls on Twitter, whatever tickles your fancy. I hope I armed you with some information to go out, go forth, and share with the world, because frankly, it's just not being done by our mainstream media, and that's precisely why this podcast needs to exist. And on that, before I give you Nigel, I'd like to just remind you all that opinions are like assholes. Everybody's got one, but this asshole, of course, has the right opinion right here at therightopinion.podbean.com. This is obviously on the way out the door, this beautiful speech by Nigel Farage, one of the most baller things in modern political world history, for that matter. Worth note, towards the end of the clip, you're going to hear the EU chairwoman talking about flags. Nigel and his UK congregation brought Union Jack flags with them, which are banned in the EU, as all country flags are, because they don't want these representatives to identify as members of their given country, as British, as French, as German. They want them to all identify as European, because that's the type of globalist brainwashing tactic that they think will work. And thankfully for all of us, it did not work on Mr. Farage and the good people of Britain. Hats off to them, really. Happy Brexit to all you guys. As somebody who has no skin in the game whatsoever, I don't know that I've ever been happier or prouder of an organization that, again, I have no affiliation with, the fine people of Britain getting out of the European Union. Hats off to all of you folks. And here is Nigel Farage giving the good old 5-minute long verbal middle finger to the European Union, and good for him. Thank you guys again. I will talk to you next time. Peace.
I know you want to ban our national flags, but we're going to wave you goodbye, and we'll look forward in the future to working with you as sovereign.
If you disobey the rules, you get cut off. Could we please remove the flags?
So this is it, the final chapter, the end of the road. A 47-year political experiment that the British, frankly, have never been very happy with. My mother and father signed up to a common market, not to a political union, not to flags, anthems, presidents, and now you even want your own army. For me, it's been 27 years of campaigning and over 20 years here in this Parliament. I'm not particularly happy with the agreement we're being asked to vote on tonight, but Boris has been remarkably bold in the last few months, and Ms von der Leyen, he's made it clear, he's promised us there'll be no level playing field. And on that basis, I wish him every success in the next round of negotiations, I really do. But the most significant point is this. What happens at 11 p.m. this Friday, the 31st of January, 2020, marks the point of no return. Once we've left, we are never coming back, and the rest, frankly, is detail. We're going, we will be gone. And that should be the summit of my own political ambitions. I walked in here, as I've said before, you all thought it was terribly funny. You stopped laughing in 2016. But my view has changed of Europe since I joined. In 2005, I saw the constitution that had been drafted by Giscard and others. I saw it rejected by the French in a referendum. I saw it rejected by the Dutch in a referendum. And I saw you in these institutions ignore them, bring it back as the Lisbon Treaty, and boast you could ram it through without there being referendums. Well, the Irish did have a vote and did say no and were forced to vote again. You're very good at making people vote again, but what we've proved is the British are too big to bully, thank goodness. So I became an outright opponent of the entire European project. I want Brexit to start a debate across the rest of Europe. What do we want from Europe? If we want trade, friendship, cooperation, reciprocity. We don't need a European Commission. We don't need a European Court. We don't need these institutions and all of this power. And I can promise you, both in UKIP and indeed in the Brexit Party, we love Europe. We just hate the European Union. It's as simple as that. So I'm hoping this begins the end of this project. It's a bad project. It isn't just undemocratic, it's anti-democratic, and it puts in that front row. It gives people power without accountability. People who cannot be held to account by the electorate, and that is an unacceptable structure. Indeed, there's an historic battle going on now across the West, in Europe, America and elsewhere. It is globalism against populism. And you may loathe populism, but I tell you a funny thing, it's becoming very popular. And it has great benefits. No more financial contributions, no more European Court of Justice, no more common fisheries policy, no more being talked down to, no more being bullied, no more Guy Verhofstadt. I mean, what's not to like? I know you're going to miss us. I know you want to ban our national flags, but we're going to wave you goodbye. And we'll look forward in the future to working with you as sovereign.
If you disobey the rules, you get cut off. Could we please remove the flags? Mr. Farage, could we remove the flags, please?
That's it. It's all over. Finished. It's gone.
Could I please ask for quiet?